Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I am so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable, maybe a blanket, maybe a warm drink, maybe just the quiet side of your pillow if you are listening with your eyes half closed already, because tonight we're going somewhere Americans do not usually go when they talk about crime. Not to a prison yard, not to a police station, not to a courtroom where a judge sits high above everyone else and calls out a sentence. We're going to a kitchen table, a rented room, a bare apartment over a shop, a farm porch with the paint peeling off the rail, a boarding house where a man has just counted the coins in his pocket for the third time and somehow found fewer of them than he found the first 2 times. We're going into the years when ordinary Americans, people who had never thought of themselves as desperate, began to discover how thin the wall really was between respectability and breaking the law. That is the thing about the Great Depression that we often miss. We remember the photographs, the bread lines, the men in hats standing with their hands in their pockets, the dust rising over a field, the mother staring past the camera with children leaning against her shoulders. We remember those images so well that sometimes they become the whole story. Poverty becomes a picture. Hardship becomes a chapter in a school book. A stock market crash becomes a date. October 1929, something to memorise and move on from. But for the people who lived through it, the Depression was not a photograph. It was Tuesday morning. It was a landlord knocking. It was a child asking for another piece of bread when there was not another piece of bread. It was the shame of standing in line where neighbours could see you. It was looking at a grocery window, seeing apples stacked in neat rows, knowing you had worked all your life, knowing you had done what people told you a decent person was supposed to do, and still not having the nickel to buy one. Stay with me tonight, because this story is not really about gangsters, although we will meet them. It is not really about bank robbers, although Americans in the 1930s knew their names the way people today know the names of movie stars. It is about the much quieter and more unsettling question of what happens when the law keeps saying no, but hunger keeps saying now. What happens when a man who has never stolen anything in his life takes coal from a railroad yard because his children are cold? What happens when a mother waters down the milk, then waters it down again, then finally walks out of a store with something hidden under her coat because the baby cannot drink promises? What happens when boys who should have been in school climb into empty freight cars and become trespassers before they are old enough to shave? What happens when the difference between a criminal and a citizen becomes not morality, not character, not upbringing, but whether there is food in the cupboard at the exact moment temptation appears? Before we step into that world, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in bed with the lights low? Are you on a couch after a long day? Are you working late somewhere, with this playing in the background while the rest of the house is quiet? Maybe you're in a city apartment, maybe a small town, maybe a place where the nearest store is still a drive away. Wherever you are, look around for just a second at the ordinary safety of your room. A switch on the wall, a refrigerator humming, a door that locks, a phone close enough to reach. These little things feel normal to us because they are always there. But in the early 1930s, millions of Americans watched normal things disappear one by one. And the strange part is that most of them did not disappear all at once. That would have been easier to understand. A disaster that arrives in one clean motion at least gives people something to point at. The Depression arrived more like a slow leak. A job ended, a bank closed, a bill went unpaid, a meal got smaller, a coat was pawned, pride was swallowed, then swallowed again. And by the time people understood that the life they had known was not coming back soon, many of them had already begun doing things they once would have condemned. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like history told slowly, not just through presidents and speeches and battles, but through rooms and streets and ordinary hands trying to survive ordinary days that became impossible, it would mean a great deal to me if you gave this video a like and subscribed. You do not have to do it right now. Do it later, when something in the story catches you, when a detail stays with you a little longer than expected, And if you want to leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight, or whether anyone in your family ever told you stories about the Depression, I would genuinely love to read it. Those family memories matter, because for many households the Great Depression was not just an event in the past. It became a warning, a habit, a way of folding paper bags and saving string and never throwing away food without feeling a small tug of guilt. Now, let us go back to an American morning in 1931. Not the morning of the stock market crash, not the dramatic beginning. Those are important, but they are not where this story truly lives. Let us begin after the first shock had already passed, after the newspapers had printed their worst headlines and the country had begun to realise that something deeper had broken. Picture a man named Frank. He is not famous. He is not based on one single person, but on thousands of men whose names never entered history books. He is 38 years old, maybe a machinist, maybe a clerk, maybe a delivery driver in a Midwestern city where factories had once sounded like the heartbeat of the whole place. He has a wife, 2 children, a rented flat, a Sunday suit, a few tools, a pocket watch from better years, and until recently he had something even more valuable than any of those things. He had the assumption that work would be there if he was willing to do it. That assumption mattered. It was part of how Americans understood themselves in the years before the Depression. The country had problems long before 1929, serious problems, unfairness, poverty, debt, racial violence, labour exploitation, farm hardship, and all the things people like to forget when they describe the past as simple. But even with all that, billions of Americans believed in the basic bargain that if you got up early, kept your head down, worked hard and avoided trouble, you could stay on the safe side of life. You might not become rich. Most people did not. You might not own much. You might not have leisure in the way we understand it. But you could remain respectable. You could pay the rent. You could feed the children. You could owe a little money and still sleep at night because next week's wages were coming. Then the wages stopped coming. For Frank it began with shorter hours. That was how it often started. The foreman gathered the men and said business was slow. No one was being let go yet, not exactly. The company was just cutting back. 3 days a week instead of 6. Then 2. Then there was a notice. Then there was no need to come in Monday. Men who had built their identities around usefulness walked out of factories carrying lunch pails that suddenly looked foolish in their hands. They said very little at first. That is something you see again and again in accounts from these years. The silence. Not because people had nothing to say, but because saying it would make it real. A man could come home early once and call it a change in schedule. He could come home early twice and say there had been a slowdown. But after a while, the children noticed he was still in the house at noon. His wife noticed the way he read the same newspaper advertisements over and over. The neighbours noticed too, because neighbourhoods notice everything, especially when everyone is afraid the same thing is coming for them next. By 1933, about 1 out of every 4 workers in the United States was unemployed. That number is so large that it almost becomes useless until you bring it down to the level of a street. Think of 4 houses in a row. In one of them, the income is gone. Now think of the stores those families used to buy from, the landlord waiting for rent, the grocer extending credit until he cannot extend it anymore, the church trying to help more people with fewer donations, the city relief office crowded beyond anything it was prepared to handle. Unemployment was not just a private misfortune, it spread outward. It turned a whole community into a place where everyone was calculating, delaying, borrowing, selling, waiting. And then there were the banks. This is another part of the story that is easy to say quickly and hard to feel properly. Thousands of banks failed during the early years of the Depression. In the time before federal deposit insurance protected ordinary savings, a bank failure could mean that the money people had trusted to that bank was simply gone, not delayed, not temporarily unavailable, gone. Imagine walking to the bank because you have heard a rumour, because someone at the market said there was trouble, because men were gathering outside the doors. Imagine standing in a line that grows more frightened by the minute. Imagine reaching the front too late. The doors close, a notice appears. The money you saved from years of work, the money for rent, seed, medicine, winter coal, a daughter's shoes, is now locked behind glass and paperwork and promises that will not buy supper. This is the point where we need to be careful, because it would be easy to tell the story as if people became criminals all at once, as if hunger flipped a switch and honest Americans immediately became thieves. That is not how it happened for most people. For most, the first crimes were small. Some were so small that the people committing them may not have used the word crime at all. A man slipped onto a railroad property after dark and filled a sack with coal spilled from a freight car. A boy reached through the back of a bakery wagon and took rolls that would have been thrown away. A woman kept quiet when a shopkeeper made a mistake in her favour, because correcting him would mean losing the only advantage she had seen in weeks. Someone cut a fence. Someone took fruit from an orchard. Someone sold homemade liquor in a dry county because Prohibition had already taught Americans that law and survival did not always sit comfortably at the same table. Someone lied on a relief form. Someone gave a false name at a mission to get a second meal. These were not the crimes that made headlines. No one wrote folk songs about a father stealing coal. No newspaper sent a photographer to capture a mother taking milk. But these small acts matter because they reveal the real moral pressure of the Depression. The country did not simply produce more famous criminals. It produced more situations in which ordinary people had to choose between obedience and need. And once a person crossed that line the first time, even for a reason almost anyone could understand, the line never looked quite as solid again. Here is something I want you to sit with for a moment. In comfortable times, people often talk about the law as if it is a fixed thing, clean and obvious. You obey it or you do not. You are honest or you are not. You are the kind of person who steals or the kind of person who would never steal. But the Depression placed millions of people into circumstances where those categories began to bend. A hungry child does not ask whether the loaf came through proper channels. A cold room does not care whether the coal was purchased. A landlord who wants rent does not accept dignity as payment. This does not mean every theft was justified, or every person who broke the law was noble. History is rarely that tidy. Some people exploited the chaos. Some harmed others. Some used desperation as an excuse for cruelty. But many others broke rules in ways that were quiet, reluctant, and directly connected to the failure of the world around them to provide any legal path forward. And the country knew it. That is one of the most interesting and uncomfortable things about this period. Americans did not respond to Depression-era crime in one simple way. They feared it. They condemned it. They demanded order. But they also sympathized with it, especially when the targets were banks, railroads, landlords, and large businesses that many people blame for the misery around them. When John Dillinger robbed banks, crowds did not always react to him as they would have reacted to an ordinary murderer or thief. Some saw him as dangerous, and he was, but others saw a man taking money from the same institutions that had taken homes, farms, and savings from ordinary people. That sympathy did not make him harmless. It did not make the violence less real. But it tells us something about the national mood. During the Depression, the law still had authority, but the institutions behind the law had lost a great deal of moral trust. This loss of trust reached into places that had once seemed stable. Farmers facing foreclosure sometimes gathered in groups to prevent auctions from going forward. In some communities, when a bank tried to sell a neighbour's farm, local men arrived in large numbers and intimidated bidders into silence. A farm worth thousands might be sold back to the original owner for a few dollars because no one else dared bid. Technically, this was interference. It was intimidation. It was unlawful. But to the people standing there, it felt like justice. The bank had paper. The farmer had years of labour in the soil. Which claim mattered more? In normal times, the answer was clear enough for a sheriff to enforce. In Depression times, even sheriffs sometimes hesitated. because the sheriff's cousin might be losing a farm next week. In cities, the same kind of pressure built around evictions. A family's furniture would be carried out to the sidewalk by order of the court, and neighbours would gather. Sometimes they watched in silence. Sometimes they carried the furniture right back inside after the marshal left. In some places, these anti-eviction actions became organised. Crowds blocked doorways. People shouted down officials. Beds, chairs and stoves moved back and forth between apartment and street, like objects in a strange public argument over who had the right to remain indoors. Again, the legal answer was one thing. The human answer was another. The Depression forced those two answers into conflict in front of everyone. That conflict is where our story lives tonight. Not in the idea that Americans suddenly forgot right from wrong. Not in the lazy claim that poverty automatically creates crime. It does not. Poor people are not criminals by nature, and most desperate people in the 1930s did not become gangsters or robbers. Most endured. Most stretched meals, searched for work, borrowed, patched, waited, and tried to keep some part of their former selves intact. But the Depression exposed something that polite society preferred not to admit. Respectability often depends on conditions. It depends on employment, credit, housing, health, and the belief that tomorrow will not be worse than today. Remove those supports, and people who once seemed safely inside the rules may find themselves standing outside them, not because their character changed overnight, but because the ground beneath their character gave way. Think again of Frank at the kitchen table. His wife has placed supper in front of the children first. Maybe potatoes, maybe beans, maybe bread with gravy if there is gravy. He says he is not hungry, which is a lie so common in hard times that families recognise it without discussing it. His son needs shoes. His daughter has a cough. The rent is already late. In his pocket is a notice from a relief office telling him to return another day. Outside, in the rail yard near the edge of town, there is coal. Not guarded well, not impossible to reach. Coal that belongs to a company, yes, but also coal that could make the room warm. 10 years earlier, Frank might have judged a man for taking it. 5 years earlier, he might have said theft was theft and meant it. Tonight he's not thinking in slogans. He's thinking about the stove. That is how it begins for many people. Not with greed, not with a plan, not with a sudden desire to live outside the law. It begins with a practical problem and no acceptable solution. It begins when a person waits for help and help does not come. It begins when shame becomes less powerful than cold. It begins when hunger turns the law from a moral boundary into an obstacle. There is a particular sadness in that, and also a warning. The Great Depression did not create desperation out of nothing. It revealed how many Americans had been living closer to the edge than anyone wanted to admit. A lost job, a failed bank, a bad harvest, an illness, a missed rent payment, and the respectable household could begin sliding toward choices it had never imagined making. The distance between the safe life and the desperate life was not miles. Sometimes it was one paycheck. Sometimes it was one locked bank door. Sometimes it was one empty cupboard at the wrong hour of the evening. So tonight we are going to walk slowly through that distance. We are going to look at the pay envelopes that stopped coming, the bread lines that embarrassed men who had once fed their families without help, the freight trains that carried boys into danger, the coal yards and grocery stalls where necessity became theft, the bank robbers who became folk heroes because the public was angry enough to confuse revenge with justice, and the shanty towns where police, politicians and hungry citizens argued over what kind of country America was becoming. We will not rush through it. We will not turn suffering into decoration. We will stay close to the ordinary people, because that is where the most revealing history usually waits. The first place to begin is not with a gun, or a jail cell, or a wanted poster. It is with the moment before all that, the quieter moment, the one no camera captured. A worker comes home early. His wife looks up and knows from his face that something has happened. He hangs his coat carefully because habits of order survive even when the world is disorderly. He sits down, not because he is resting, but because standing would make him feel foolish. On the table there may be an envelope, thinner than it used to be, or no envelope at all. The children are in the next room, still young enough to think adults can fix anything. Outside, the country is entering a crisis that will change banks, elections, labour laws, policing, welfare, and the meaning of federal responsibility. But inside that room, before any of those larger changes can be understood, there is only one fact. The money is gone, and tomorrow still expects to be lived. The first thing that disappeared was not the house. It was not the furniture. It was not the wedding photograph on the shelf, or the children's school books, or the good coat hanging by the door, brushed and saved for Sundays. The first thing that disappeared was the sound of certainty. In thousands of American homes during the early years of the Great Depression, there was a particular sound people had become used to hearing at the end of a working week. A door opening, a lunch pail set down, boots on a kitchen floor, a man clearing his throat as he came in from the street or the factory yard or the delivery route. Then the small paper envelope placed on the table or handed quietly to his wife. It was not usually a dramatic object. It did not look like much. Just a folded pay envelope with a name, a date, and the amount written or stamped on the outside. But inside that envelope was the week's order. Rent, coal, flour, milk, shoes if there was enough left, a few cents for church, maybe a little put away in a jar or a bank if the family had managed to keep that habit. The envelope was not simply money. It was proof that the household still belonged to the ordinary world. When the envelope became thin, the house changed, not immediately in ways a visitor might notice. The chairs were still there, the stove still stood in the kitchen, the curtains still hung in the window, though they might not be washed as often. The children still went in and out, but inside the rooms, calculations began to replace routines. A meal was no longer just a meal, it was a decision about tomorrow. A fire was no longer just a fire. It was a question of how much coal remained in the bin. A pair of socks was no longer simply worn out. It was a small problem with no easy replacement. The family did not say, "We are falling." They said, "We will make this last. We will wait until next week. We will see what happens." That phrase, "we will see," carried many American families through the early Depression because people could not yet bring themselves to name the full size of what had happened. It is important to understand how ordinary the first stage often looked. A man did not always lose his job in one clean blow. Many did, of course, and for them the shock was immediate. But for millions of others, the collapse arrived in reductions. A factory moved from 6 days to 5, then to 3. A store cut wages before it cut staff. A construction crew delayed a project. A railroad laid men off for a few weeks and then did not call them back. Salesmen found that customers still listened politely but no longer bought. Barbers had empty chairs. Tailors had coats that stayed unaltered because no one could pay. Restaurants closed early. Hotels dismissed maids. The damage moved through the country like a problem with many hands, touching one trade, then another, until even people who had believed themselves safe found that safety had been built out of other people's spending. A pay envelope could tell the whole story without a word. Suppose it had once held $28 for a week's labour. That was not wealth, but it could run a modest household if the rent was low and no one got sick. Then it held 19, then 12. Then there were 2 days of work and a promise that business would pick up. The children might not understand the numbers, but they understood the mood at the table when the envelope was opened. Adults tried to conceal fear from children, and children, as they always do, learned to read what was not said. They heard the shorter answers. They noticed when their mother stopped asking for certain things. They noticed when their father left the table before finishing, not because he was full, but because watching others eat was easier if he was standing at the sink or looking out the window. There was shame in unemployment that is hard to explain now without sounding unfair to the people who felt it. A man who lost his work in the Depression had often been taught from boyhood that work was the measure of him. Not kindness, not imagination, not patience with a frightened child, but work. A husband provided, a father provided. A man rose early, accepted difficult conditions, and brought something home. This belief could be cruel, but it was deeply rooted. When the work vanished, many men experienced it not only as economic loss, but as personal failure, even when there was nothing personal about it. A factory closing did not mean a worker had become lazy. A bank failure did not mean a depositor had been foolish. A national collapse did not mean one household had misbehaved. Yet shame does not always obey facts. It enters through habit. It tells a man that if he were better, stronger, smarter, more useful, there would be an envelope on the table. Women had their own kind of arithmetic, and it was often more immediate. They were the ones who saw exactly what remained in the cupboard. They knew how much flour was in the sack by lifting it. They knew whether coffee could be stretched by adding roasted grain or chicory. They knew how many slices could be cut from a loaf before the children noticed that the slices had become thinner. They knew which shopkeeper might still extend credit and which one had already begun looking away when customers entered. Many women in the Depression became experts in delay. Delay the rent if the landlord was patient. Delay new shoes if cardboard could be cut and placed inside the old ones. Delay the doctor if fever did not climb too high. Delay the truth if the children asked whether everything was going to be all right. This is where the house went quiet. Not silent exactly. There were still sounds. A kettle, a chair dragged across the floor, a baby crying, a radio if the family had one and still had electricity. But the household noise changed. People saved words because words could lead to arguments, and arguments could lead to admissions. The father did not want to say he had walked 5 miles looking for work and found none. The mother did not want to say that the grocer had refused more credit. The oldest child did not want to say that classmates had noticed the patched coat. The younger ones did not want to ask why supper was smaller. Silence became a way of protecting one another from facts everyone already knew. In city after city, men walked. That is one of the details that appears constantly in recollections from the Depression, and it should not be passed over quickly. Men walked from factory gate to factory gate, from office to office, from warehouse to loading dock, asking whether there was any work. They walked because car fare cost money. They walked because standing still at home felt worse. They walked because searching for work allowed them to remain, at least outwardly, the kind of men who were trying. Some carried newspapers folded open to the employment advertisements. Some stood outside places that had posted no signs at all, hoping a foreman might need one extra pair of hands. A man might begin the morning clean-shaven, with his collar straight and his shoes brushed, and return at dusk with dust on his cuffs, and nothing to show except the exhaustion of not being wanted. There is a particular cruelty in being willing to work when no one will buy your labour. It turns effort into something almost humiliating. A man could offer strength, punctuality, experience, loyalty, and years of skill, and still be told there was no need for him. The rejection was not always spoken harshly. Sometimes it came with sympathy. "Sorry, nothing today. Try next week." We had to let our own men go. The words were polite. The result was the same. He went home empty. And home, which should have been the place where a person recovered from the world, became the place where the world's failure had to be explained again. The empty pay envelope did not only affect adults. Children entered the Depression through changes in texture. They learned that bread could be stale and still be supper. They learned that meat was not expected every day. They learned that birthdays could be acknowledged without presents. They learned to avoid mentioning school fees, lost pencils, broken soles, and field trips that cost a dime. Some left school earlier than they would have in better times. Some sold newspapers. Some shined shoes. Some watched younger siblings while their mothers took in washing or sewing. A child who brought home a few coins might feel proud, and the parents might praise him. But beneath that praise was something painful. Childhood was being converted into income. In rural areas, the empty pay envelope had a different shape because many farm families did not live by weekly wages in the same way. Their crisis often came through prices, debts and mortgages. Wheat, cotton, corn and livestock could sell for so little that the labour of raising them seemed almost mocked by the market. A farmer might produce more than ever and still be unable to pay what he owed. The barn could be full and the account empty. This contradiction drove people mad with frustration. Food existed, goods existed, men and women willing to work existed, yet families went hungry because the system that moved money through the country had jammed. A person did not need a university education to see something wrong in that. They saw fields, warehouses, mills, and hungry children at the same time, and the old explanations began to sound thin. When income failed, families sold things. The first items were usually those that could be spared without announcing disaster. A watch, a ring if sentiment had to yield to rent, extra bedding, a radio. Tools, though selling tools was dangerous because tools might be needed if work returned. Women sold dresses, silver, sewing machines, anything that could be taken to a pawn shop or a neighbour with a little cash. Pawn shops became unofficial weather stations of misery. They recorded the pressure falling in a community long before any government report could do so. A wedding ring across the counter, a winter coat in October, a set of carpenter's tools from a man who still hoped to be called back. These objects were not only goods, they were pieces of a life being broken into smaller units in exchange for time. Credit stretched and then snapped. Many neighbourhoods ran on trust before they ran out of it. The grocer knew the families. The butcher knew who had paid late before and who was usually reliable. Landlords sometimes waited if they could. Doctors made calls knowing payment might not come soon. This web of delayed payment kept many people afloat during the first months of hardship, but it could not hold forever. The grocer also had suppliers. The landlord also had taxes and mortgages. The doctor also had bills. When everyone owed everyone, kindness became harder to finance. A man who had extended credit for years might finally say no, not because he had become cruel, but because his own children were eating from the same shrinking economy. Relief when it came was often local, limited, and humiliating. Before the New Deal expanded federal involvement, much of the burden fell on cities, counties, charities, churches, and private organisations. Their resources were overwhelmed. Applicants waited in lines and answered questions that could feel like accusations. How long have you been out of work? Do you own property? Do you have relatives who can help? Have you sold what you can sell? Some relief offices investigated homes to determine whether families were truly needy. Imagine that for a moment, not as policy, but as an experience. A stranger comes into your kitchen and looks at what you still possess. A decent table might count against you. A radio might suggest you had not suffered enough. The poor were expected to prove need, but not to display too much former comfort. The line between deserving and undeserving could be drawn by people who had never sat at your table at night. This pressure created an atmosphere in which small dishonesties became almost ordinary. A man might underreport a few coins earned from odd work, because admitting them would reduce relief more than the work was worth. A widow might claim a child was younger than he was to qualify for assistance. A family might hide an object during an inspection, because selling it would bring only pennies, and keeping it preserved a piece of dignity. These were not the acts of professional criminals. They were survival adjustments made under systems that often demanded complete honesty from people living in conditions that punished honesty too severely. When rules are written for order, but life has become disorder, people begin to negotiate with the rules in private. The same thing happened with utilities. A bill went unpaid. Gas was shut off. Electricity, if the home had it, could be disconnected. Some families learned to live around it. Others found ways to reconnect what had been cut. Tapping a line, bypassing a meter, sharing from a neighbour, using a dangerous stove in a closed room. These acts could be illegal or unsafe. sometimes both, but they emerge from the immediate need to cook, heat, and see. The law treated a stolen service as theft. The household experienced it as one more attempt to keep the evening from becoming impossible. This is not to excuse every action, but to understand the pressure that made them thinkable. The emotional life of the home narrowed. Families that had once planned began to endure. Planning requires trust in the future. Endurance requires only the next task. Get through breakfast, find work, keep the children warm, avoid the landlord, stretch supper, mend the coat, sleep if worry allows it, repeat. In such conditions, the future becomes too expensive to imagine. A child asking about Christmas could wound a parent without intending to. A wife mentioning rent could sound like blame even when she meant partnership. A husband promising that things would improve could hear the weakness in his own promise. Love remained, but it had to move carefully through rooms crowded with fear. There were also changes in authority inside the home. If the father's wages had once organised the household, their absence altered the balance in ways no one had prepared for. Women who took in laundry or borders or sewing sometimes became the only source of cash. Older children who found small jobs might bring in money while their fathers brought in none. This did not always produce open conflict, but it could produce discomfort. The old roles had not disappeared from people's minds simply because the economy had stopped supporting them. A man could be grateful for his wife's earnings and still feel diminished by them. A mother could rely on a son's newspaper money and still hate that she had to. The Depression did not invent family tension, but it gave tension new materials. The home also became a place where crime was discussed differently. In better times, a stolen loaf might have been described as wrongdoing, plain and simple. In Depression times, the first question often became, who stole it and why? Newspapers carried stories of robberies, burglaries, frauds and hold-ups. But ordinary people made distinctions among them. A man who robbed another worker might be despised. A boy who took food might be pitied. A gang that terrorised a store could be feared. A crowd that blocked an eviction could be admired. The law used categories, but communities used circumstances. That difference mattered, because once people began judging illegal acts by need, the moral authority of the law became less automatic. There are accounts from these years of judges showing leniency in cases that would once have been treated more severely. A person arrested for stealing food might be released with a warning, or local officials might quietly arrange help rather than punishment. Not always. There was plenty of harshness too, especially toward the poor, migrants, Black Americans, immigrants, and anyone already viewed with suspicion by local authorities. But the Depression made even some officials aware that punishing hunger could look indecent. A courtroom could process a theft charge, but everyone in the room might know the real offender was larger than the person standing before the bench. This is where the empty pay envelope becomes more than a household object. It becomes the beginning of a moral shift. The Depression forced Americans to ask whether legality and fairness were always the same thing. If a bank could foreclose on a farm after years of payments because the final payments failed during an economic collapse, was that legal? Yes. Was it fair? Many neighbours said no. If a landlord could put a family's furniture on the sidewalk in winter because rent was overdue, was that legal? Often, yes. Was it right? The crowd gathering on the curb might have a different answer. If a railroad-owned coal spilled along its yard while children shivered nearby, did ownership settle the matter completely? The company would say yes. The father holding a sack in the dark might not be so sure. Ownership is easy to defend when everyone has enough. It becomes harder to explain to people who can see unused goods and unmet need at the same time. During the Depression, Americans encountered this contradiction everywhere. Milk dumped because prices were too low while children lacked milk. Crops ploughed under in attempts to raise prices while families stood in food lines. Warehouses with goods that could not be sold while people went without. This did not mean the economic problems were simple. They were not. But people living through them did not experience them as theories. They experienced them as insults. The country had things. The people needed things. Yet the rules connecting one to the other had failed. When rules fail too visibly, people begin to make their own exceptions. Inside the quiet house, those exceptions often began as thoughts before they became actions. A man lying awake might remember which coal yard had poor fencing. A mother might know which grocer left crates near the alley. A teenage boy might hear from friends that there was work 2 states away if he could get there, and freight trains ran every night. The first step into illegality was sometimes planned with fear, and sometimes taken almost without thinking. A hand reached. A fence was crossed. A false statement was made. A ride was taken. Afterward, there might be relief, shame, or both. A sack of coal on the floor could warm a room and darken a conscience at the same time. That mixture is important. We should not flatten these people into saints of necessity. Many knew exactly when they had crossed a line. Some prayed about it. Some justified it. Some decided not to speak of it. Others grew angry that they had been placed in such a position at all. The depression did not remove moral feeling. It complicated it. A father could tell his son not to steal while wearing shoes bought with money from something he himself had taken. A mother could insist on honesty while hiding the fact that she had lied to a relief worker. These contradictions did not make them hypocrites in some simple way. They made them human beings under pressure, trying to preserve lessons they could no longer fully live by. As the weeks became months and the months became years, the quiet in the house changed again. At first, silence came from shock. Later, it came from adaptation. People learned which subjects to avoid. They learned which neighbours were also in trouble. They learned the hours when leftovers might be available behind a restaurant. They learned that railroad police were harsher in one yard than another. They learned which charity asked fewer questions. They learned how to patch, substitute, barter and disappear when necessary. Respectable families did not announce these lessons, but they absorbed them. The Depression created an education no one wanted, and one part of that education was learning how to bend rules without breaking completely under the guilt of it. For some people, the empty envelope would eventually lead back to work. A relief job, a government project, a reopened factory, a farm program that steadied income. Not quickly enough, not for everyone, and not without political conflict, but for many households the long emergency eventually loosened its grip. For others, the damage lasted a lifetime. Children who had watched parents count pennies grew into adults who saved obsessively. Men who had felt useless never entirely recovered their confidence. Women who had stretched food beyond reason kept doing it even when cupboards filled again. And families who had crossed legal or moral lines in the worst years often carried those memories privately, not as stories for company, but as facts folded away with the old papers. Still, before the bank robbers, before the freight trains, before the breadline thefts and the eviction crowds, there was this smaller scene. A table, an envelope, a family trying not to look frightened in front of one another. The country's economic collapse entered that room not as an idea, but as subtraction. Less money, less food, less heat, less patience, less certainty. When enough was taken away, the old rules did not vanish, but they began to compete with stronger needs. The house went quiet because everyone inside it was listening for the same thing: the return of work, the return of wages, the return of ordinary life. And while they waited, cupboards emptied, shoes wore through, debts grew teeth, and outside the home the city offered lines, locked doors, guarded yards and store windows full of things that could still be seen, even when they could no longer be bought. The first line a person joined was not always a bread line. Sometimes it was a line outside a factory gate before dawn, men standing shoulder to shoulder in the cold because a rumour had passed through the neighbourhood that the company might take on 6 workers that morning. Sometimes it was a line at a city relief office, where people waited with papers folded in their hands and tried not to look too closely at the faces around them, because recognising a neighbour there made the shame worse for both of you. Sometimes it was a line behind a church basement, where women with tired eyes ladled soup into bowls and tried to make one pot feed more people than it had any honest right to feed. But eventually, for millions of Americans, it became the line we remember most clearly now, the bread line. A row of bodies on a sidewalk, moving slowly toward a doorway or a wagon or a counter, each person waiting for something small enough to hold in one hand and large enough to keep humiliation from turning into panic. You've probably seen photographs of those lines. Men in overcoats, caps pulled low, hands buried in pockets, faces turned away from the camera. What is easy to miss is how quiet those lines often were. A bread line was not a marketplace. It was not a crowd at a ball game or a gathering outside a theatre. It was a public admission that private methods had failed. Many of the people standing there had once taken pride in never needing help. Some had owned businesses. Some had worn collars and ties to work. Some had supported families for 20 years without ever asking a stranger for anything. Now they stood with everyone else, waiting for bread, coffee, stew, donuts, whatever was available. The food mattered. Of course it did. But so did the act of standing there. The line changed a person. It taught him that need could be visible. In New York, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, Philadelphia, and smaller cities all across the country, bread lines became part of the daily landscape. Some were organised by charities, some were run by missions, some were supported by churches, some depended on private donations from people who still had a little to spare and were afraid of what might happen if the hungry were left entirely on their own. In the early years of the Depression, before the federal government took on a larger role in relief, these local efforts carried a burden far too large for them. A kitchen that could feed a few hundred might face a few thousand. A church pantry meant for emergencies found that the emergency did not end. Volunteers who had begun with sympathy learned the exhaustion of constant need. There is only so much soup a person can stretch before it becomes hot water with a memory of vegetables. Now, imagine being a father in that line. Not a criminal, not a beggar by habit. A man who'd worked since he was 14 and could still describe the inside of a factory by sound alone. He knows which belt is slipping, which machine is running too hot, which supervisor is in a bad mood, which door sticks in winter. That knowledge once had value. It put food on the table. But on this morning, in this line, none of it matters. The man in front of him used to be a bookkeeper. The man behind him used to lay brick. Across the street, a boy is selling newspapers no one wants to buy. The father keeps his face still. He has learned not to look hungry in public if he can help it. Then the line moves, and when he reaches the front, someone places bread in his hand. There is a moment after that which history rarely pauses to examine. What does he do with the bread? Does he eat it immediately because he has not eaten since yesterday? Does he put it inside his coat and take it home for the children? Does he divide it in an alley, eating the smallest part himself? Does he tell his wife he already ate, which is a small lie that almost counts as kindness? We do not know, because most men did not write down the moral details of receiving bread. But we can understand the pressure. Hunger makes the body selfish, and love asks the body to resist. That is one of the cruelties of family poverty. The hungriest person in the room may be the one most determined to say he is fine. Breadlines created another problem, one that was not only physical. They trained people to wait, waiting for food, waiting for work, waiting for a notice, waiting for a decision from a relief board, waiting for a landlord to lose patience, waiting for a bank to reopen, waiting for a government that had not yet decided what it owed to citizens trapped by an economic disaster. Waiting can look passive from a distance, but it is not passive when there is hunger in it. It is labour of a different kind. It requires a person to hold himself together while time does nothing useful. And then there were the back doors. If the bread line was the public face of hunger, the back door was its private negotiation. Every town had them. the rear entrance of a bakery where stale loaves might be set aside, the alley behind a restaurant where scraps could be collected if the cook was merciful, the kitchen door of a hotel, a boarding house, a diner, a grocer, a butcher. People learned which doors might open and which would not. They learned who would hand out leftovers and who would threaten to call the police. A woman might send a child because children softened people. A man might avoid a place entirely because being recognised by the owner would be worse than going without. Some people knocked, some waited near the bins, some came after closing time, hoping anything discarded would not yet be spoiled. Do not picture this too neatly. Backdoor hunger was awkward. It was full of small humiliations. A cook might be kind one day and angry the next. A restaurant owner might give coffee, but no bread, bones, but no meat, bruised fruit, but only if the person promised not to tell others. Charity often came with conditions because the giver was afraid of being overwhelmed. One person fed at the door could become 20 the next evening. A business struggling to survive could not become a relief agency without collapsing itself. So even kindness had to protect itself. That meant people in need learned to approach carefully, to read faces quickly, to accept insult if food came with it, and to leave without argument if it did not. Here is where the first small theft often lived, not in the dramatic darkness of a robbery, but in the grey area between waste and ownership. A bakery had day-old bread. A grocer had apples with bruises. A restaurant scraped plates into a barrel. A produce market threw away cabbage leaves, cracked potatoes, overripe bananas, tomatoes soft at one end. To the business, these things might be refuse. To the hungry, they were supper. But the law did not always pause to ask whether an object was unwanted. If it belonged to someone, taking it could still be theft. This is a hard fact to sit with because it shows how thin the line could become. A man taking a fresh loaf from the front display and a boy taking stale rolls from a back bin were not doing the same thing morally, but the boundary between them could depend on where the bread was sitting and who noticed. Markets became places of temptation. Think of a fruit stand in a city neighbourhood in 1932. Apples stacked in pyramids, oranges if the vendor had them, potatoes in sacks, onions, carrots, maybe eggs behind the counter, maybe cans of milk, maybe cuts of meat hanging where customers could see them and remember what regular meals had once looked like. People walked past these displays every day, not starving in the extreme sense that photographs from famine zones teach us to imagine, but underfed, anxious, weak around the edges, living on bread, potatoes, coffee, soup, and whatever could be stretched. Hunger does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers every time the body sees food. The hand slows. The eye measures distance. Is the vendor looking? Is the street crowded? Could one apple disappear? Would anyone truly be harmed? Would the children sleep easier with something sweet in their mouths? A person who has never been hungry may answer too quickly. Theft is wrong. Of course it is. Most people in the Depression believed that too. That is what makes the first theft so important. It didn't happen because morals had vanished. It happened because morals were forced into argument with need. A mother might stand in a store with a tin of condensed milk in her hand and understand perfectly well that walking out without paying was wrong. She might also know that her child had been crying from hunger, and that the grocer had already refused credit, and that her husband had spent the day looking for work with no result. In that moment, the question was not whether stealing was acceptable as a principle. The question was whether the principle could feed the child before morning. Shopkeepers understood this too, and that made their position difficult. Some looked away, some could not afford to. A grocer was often only a few missed payments away from ruin himself. He had wholesalers to pay, he had rent, he had family. He might know exactly why a woman tucked something under her coat and still stop her, because if he allowed one theft, others would follow and the store would fail. Depression crime placed people in conflict who were often suffering from the same crisis at different distances. The person stealing bread and the person protecting the bread might both be afraid. That fear could produce mercy. It could also produce anger. A shopkeeper who had extended credit for months could feel betrayed when a familiar customer stole from him. A customer refused credit after years of loyalty could feel abandoned and decide the shopkeeper had already broken the relationship first. Children became messengers between hunger and theft in ways adults later found painful to remember. Boys and girls were sent to stand in lines, to collect leftovers, to ask at doors, to carry baskets, to watch where food was left unattended. Some stole without being told because they had learned the situation well enough. A child might take an orange, a roll, a handful of nuts, a bottle of milk from a doorstep. Milk theft became a small but telling crime in some cities because milk was delivered early and left outside doors before households woke. A bottle could be lifted from a porch in seconds. Was it theft? Yes. Was it the act of a hardened criminal? Usually not. It was the act of someone who knew milk was there and breakfast was not. There is something especially hard about imagining a child committing a first theft, because children feel shame differently. Adults can build explanations. They can say, "I had no choice," or "I will pay it back someday," or "the company will never miss it." Children often feel the act more directly. They know they are not supposed to take. They know adults praise honesty. Yet they also hear hunger at home. A boy who steals bread and brings it to his mother may expect gratitude and receive tears instead. Not because she is angry exactly, but because the bread is useful and the method unbearable. She may scold him while slicing it. She may tell him never to do it again while making sure the smaller children eat. That contradiction enters a child and stays there. The streets taught another lesson. Police did not treat all hunger the same. A well-dressed man down on his luck might be moved along with a warning. A poorly dressed teenager, a black man, an immigrant, a migrant worker, or someone already known to authorities might be arrested or beaten for behaviour others survived without consequence. The Depression was national, but punishment was never evenly distributed. Respectability still protected those who could perform it. Clean clothes, white skin, local connections, a known family name, a church affiliation, the ability to speak politely to an officer, all of these could soften the system. Those without such protection learned that desperation made them visible in dangerous ways. Vagrancy laws became another trap. A person who had no work and no fixed place to sleep could be treated as suspicious simply for existing in public space. Loitering, trespassing, disorderly conduct, begging, sleeping in parks, entering rail yards, gathering near missions, all these could bring police attention. A hungry person did not have to steal to become criminalised. He only had to be poor in the wrong place, at the wrong hour, in front of the wrong officer. That matters because the Depression turned not only acts into crimes, but conditions into suspicion. Poverty itself began to look unlawful when it appeared on sidewalks where merchants and officials wanted order. For people still trying to preserve a home, the first small theft was often accompanied by secrecy. A father did not tell the children where the coal came from. A mother did not tell her husband she had taken something from a store. A teenager did not explain how he got the coins he placed on the table. Silence allowed the household to use what had been obtained without forcing everyone to participate in the guilt. But silence also changed the air inside the home. People sensed when something had happened. They knew which questions not to ask. An unexpected loaf, a sack of potatoes, a little meat, coal in the bin after everyone knew there had been no money for coal. These things spoke for themselves. Relief entered the house wearing a shadow. Coal was one of the most common objects around which necessity and law collided. In cold weather, hunger was not the only emergency. Heat could decide whether a family slept, whether a baby's cough worsened, whether an old person survived the night. Coal companies and railroads owned enormous quantities of fuel, and coal moved through towns in cars, yards, bins and piles. Some fell from trains, some were scattered along tracks, some sat behind fences. People gathered it in sacks, buckets, wagons, whatever they had. Children were often sent because they could move quickly and were less likely to be punished severely, though that was not guaranteed. Railroad police knew the practice well. They chased people away, confiscated sacks, sometimes made arrests. To the company, it was theft. To the family, it was warmth lying on the ground. The phrase stealing coal sounds simple until you place it beside a stove gone cold in February. Imagine a room where everyone keeps coats on indoors. The windows frost from the inside. A mother warms her hands around a cup with nothing hot in it because the gesture itself has become comforting. A child asks why there is no fire. The father knows exactly where coal can be found. It is not his. He knows that. He also knows ownership will not warm the room. If he goes out after dark with a sack and comes back with enough fuel for one night, what has happened? A crime, yes. Also a failure of the surrounding world to offer him a legal way to keep his family warm. History becomes more honest when it can hold both facts at the same time. Food theft had its own geography: bakeries, grocery stores, fruit stands, delivery wagons, warehouses, farms near towns, orchards along roads, chicken coops if things grew more desperate. The farther one moved from small acts into livestock theft or burglary, the more serious the consequences became, and communities often drew moral distinctions. Taking fallen apples from an orchard edge might be tolerated. Taking chickens from a neighbour could provoke fury, because the neighbour was likely struggling too. The Depression did not erase local ethics. It rearranged them around perceived fairness. Stealing from a large company was easier to justify than stealing from a household. Taking surplus seemed different from taking someone's last. But desperate people did not always obey these distinctions, and when need deepened, sympathy could run out. Breadlines themselves could become scenes of policing and control. A line of hungry men was a practical relief measure, but it was also a potential crowd. Officials worried about disorder. Business owners worried about customers being frightened away. Middle-class observers sometimes treated the unemployed with pity and suspicion at the same time. Were these men victims, or were they dangerous? Were they patient citizens, or a mob waiting for a spark? The answer depended on who was looking and what they feared most. Hunger in one person could be pitied. Hunger in 500 people standing together could make a city nervous. This nervousness shaped the way relief was distributed. Many programs tried to separate the deserving from the undeserving, the local from the outsider, the temporarily unfortunate from the supposedly habitual poor. Those categories had existed before the Depression, but the crisis strained them. What did deserving mean when millions were out of work through no fault of their own? What did outsider mean when men were travelling because their hometowns had no jobs? What did character mean when a person had not eaten properly in days? The old language of moral judgment did not disappear. It simply became harder to use without sounding cruel. Some Americans responded by clinging to it more tightly. They insisted that the truly honest would never steal, that relief encouraged laziness, that people in breadlines lacked initiative, that a man should go wherever work could be found. These statements had the comfort of simplicity, which is why people repeated them. But simplicity did not survive contact with the actual streets. Men did go looking. Women did stretch every resource. Children did work. Families did sell what they had. Churches did help. Cities did try. Still the lines grew. Still the cupboards emptied. Still people stole food. There were also people who became skilled at exploiting relief and charity, and we should not pretend they did not exist. Some used false names, some visited multiple kitchens, some stole not because they were starving, but because disorder created opportunity. Shopkeepers and relief workers saw enough deception to become guarded. Their suspicion then fell on people whose need was genuine. This is one of the ways a crisis damages trust. A dishonest few can harden the systems that desperate many must pass through. The person who truly needs help arrives at a counter already shadowed by the fear that someone before him lied. But for most families, the first small theft was not part of a criminal career. It was a single act or a handful of acts, committed under strain and remembered with discomfort. Years later, people who lived through the Depression often told stories of making do, of saving, of stretching meals, of kindness from neighbours, of never wasting anything. They were sometimes less willing to speak about the things taken, the lies told, the rules bent. Those memories did not fit easily into family pride. A grandfather might tell how he rode the rails, but not always how he ate along the way. A grandmother might describe soup made from bones, but not the morning she walked out with food she did not pay for. Families preserve dignity by choosing which parts of survival become stories. There is one more place we need to stand for a moment, and it is outside a restaurant near closing time. The day's customers are gone. Inside, workers are cleaning tables, stacking chairs, scraping plates, emptying bins. Out back, in the alley, a few people wait without appearing to wait. One man looks at the ground. Another pretends to read a torn newspaper. A woman holds a child whose head rests against her shoulder. The kitchen door opens, and for a second everyone looks. Maybe someone brings out scraps wrapped in paper. Maybe someone shouts for them to move along. Maybe the door closes again. That tiny uncertainty, repeated night after night in alleys across the country, tells you much of what you need to know about the moral atmosphere of the early 1930s. People were not yet robbing banks. They were waiting behind kitchens. And while they waited, they learned the layout of the city differently. They learned which bakeries discarded bread, which churches served on which nights, which grocers watched closely, which alleys had bins that could be opened quietly, which police beats were dangerous, which neighbourhoods still had charity, and which had exhausted it. Hunger turned ordinary streets into maps of possibility and risk. A city that had once been organised around work became organised around survival, for the people who could no longer bear standing in lines, for young men ashamed to remain at home, for boys who felt like extra mouths at tables already strained past reason. The next possibility was movement. If there was no food here, perhaps there was work somewhere else. If every back door in town had already been tried, perhaps another town had kinder doors. Freight trains passed through day and night, carrying goods across a country that could not employ the men who watched them. To railroad companies, the cars were private property. To the unemployed, they looked like motion itself, and motion could feel like hope when staying in one place meant watching the same cupboards empty again. So men and boys began drifting toward the tracks, not as adventurers at first, not as legends, not as the romantic wanderers that later stories sometimes made them, but as hungry people following steel lines out of towns that had run out of answers. The tracks were not hidden. That is one of the first things to understand. They ran through the country openly, through cities and mill towns and wheat country and pine woods and desert edges, past depots where people once bought tickets, past warehouses, grain elevators, stockyards, factories, and small-town platforms where families had waved to relatives leaving for visits, for college, for war, for better chances somewhere else. Railroads were already part of the American imagination long before the Depression. They meant distance, progress, industry, movement. They stitched the country together in steel. But in the early 1930s, for men and boys with no money, no job, and no ticket, the railroad began to mean something else. It became a way out that was also a crime the moment you climbed aboard. Freight trains had always attracted riders who were not supposed to be there. Seasonal workers, tramps, hobos, runaway boys, men between jobs, men who preferred the road, men who had fallen out of ordinary life for reasons of drink, injury, family rupture, or simple restlessness. This was not new in the 1930s. America had known the wandering labourer for decades. The word hobo itself belonged to an older world of harvest hands, lumber camps, railroad construction, and temporary work. But the Great Depression changed the scale. It took a practice that had existed at the edges of the economy and pushed it toward the centre of national experience. Suddenly, Men who had never imagined sleeping beside a track were studying freight schedules. Boys who should have been worrying about schoolwork were learning which cars were safer. Fathers who had once warned their sons to stay away from rail yards were walking into those same yards after dark with a blanket rolled under one arm. It is easy to romanticize this if you're not careful. Later songs and stories turn the rails into a rough kind of freedom, a life of open sky, campfires, tin cups of coffee, and men swapping news beside the tracks. There was some of that. People found companionship on the road. They shared food, directions, warnings, jokes, and the kind of hard-won practical knowledge that people develop when official systems have failed them. But for most depression riders, the train was not romance. It was cold metal, cinders in the eyes, hunger, danger, and the constant possibility of being thrown off by force in a town whose name you did not know. It was movement, yes, but movement under threat. You were going somewhere because staying had become impossible, but every mile you travelled reminded you that the country had no proper place for you. Let us follow one of those boys for a while. He is 16, maybe 17, old enough to be ashamed of eating food his parents cannot spare, young enough that his mother still sees the child in his face when he sleeps. His father has been out of work for months. There are younger children at home. The rent is uncertain. Supper has become a smaller affair, and he has noticed, as older children always notice, that when food runs short, the adults perform little tricks of sacrifice. His mother says she ate earlier. His father takes coffee and calls it enough. The boy begins to feel like a problem with shoes on. No one says this to him. They may even tell him the opposite. Stay here. We will manage. Something will turn up. But he knows there are men leaving town. He has heard that fruit picking is starting in another state, or roadwork might be available near a larger city, or some factory across the line is hiring if you can get there before the jobs are gone. The rumour may be wrong. Most rumours were. But a rumour with a train attached to it could feel stronger than the truth sitting hungry at home. He does not buy a ticket. That is the whole point. A ticket requires money. And if he had money, he might not be leaving this way. So he goes to the yard, usually not alone, because the first time is frightening, and boys rarely admit fear if another boy is there to cover it with talk. The rail yard is not quiet. Even at night it has its own work going on. Couplings slam, brakes hiss, men shout, lanterns move, engines breathe smoke and steam. A freight yard is a working machine, and it was dangerous even for men employed there who knew what they were doing. For a hungry teenager slipping between cars, it was a place that could maim him in seconds. The experienced riders knew rules the new ones did not. Do not climb between cars when the train might move. Do not trust a ladder slick with rain or frost. Do not sleep with your legs too close to the door of a boxcar because a sudden stop can throw bodies hard against wood and iron. Do not ride on top if tunnels or low bridges are coming. Do not ride under the cars unless you understand exactly where to place yourself, and even then understand that one mistake may be the last mistake you ever make. Do not jump when the train is moving too fast, no matter how loudly someone shouts at you. Keep your bundle tied. Keep one hand free. Watch for railroad police. Watch for thieves. Watch for men who are hungrier than you and less troubled by what they may do about it. Railroad police had a name among riders. Bulls, sometimes yard bulls. Their job was to protect railroad property, keep trespassers off trains, prevent theft and maintain order in a system that was already under strain. It is important to say that not every railroad policeman was a brute. Some were tired men doing a difficult job. Some looked away when they could. Some had families of their own and understood perfectly well why boys were riding. But others were harsh, and some were violent enough that their reputations moved ahead of them along the line. Riders traded warnings about particular yards. Do not get caught in that one. The bulls there carry clubs. They will take your shoes. They will dump you miles out. They will beat you before they ask where you're from. Whether every story was true mattered less than the fact that riders believed enough of them to stay afraid. Trespassing sounds mild when spoken in a courthouse. It sounds like a technical offence, a violation of property rules. On the railroad, trespassing could mean a chase through dark machinery, a club across the back, a night in jail, or being forced from a moving life into a town where police did not want transients sleeping anywhere visible. The railroad companies did not see themselves as villains for enforcing rules. Their trains carried freight. Their yards were dangerous. Unauthorized riders could be injured, could steal, could interfere with operations, could sue if hurt, could attract more riders if allowed to remain. From the company's point of view, order required removal. From the rider's point of view, removal could mean losing the only route to work, food, or distance from a home where he had become one mouth too many. The law stood with the company. Need stood with the rider. Between them was a boxcar door. Inside the boxcars, the riders formed temporary communities. A car might carry 4 men or 20. Sometimes it carried boys. Sometimes black and white riders shared space uneasily in ways shaped by the racial rules and violence of the world outside. Sometimes older hobos who knew the road looked after younger ones. Sometimes they exploited them. You cannot make this world cleaner than it was. There was kindness and there was cruelty. A man might share his last piece of bread with a stranger one evening and steal another man's coat the next morning because the night had turned cold. Hunger did not automatically make people noble, it made them exposed. A rider learned to read people quickly. The man who talked too much might be harmless or might be hiding something. The quiet one in the corner might simply be tired or might be waiting for others to sleep. A group could be safer than travelling alone, but a group could also turn against someone weak. Young boys were especially vulnerable. Many were runaways, but many others were not running from home in the usual sense. They were running from being a burden. During the worst years of the Depression, thousands of adolescents took to the roads and rails. Some told parents they were leaving, some disappeared with a note, some planned to send money back and never managed to find enough even for themselves. Their families might spend months not knowing where they were, imagining every accident the railroad could produce. What did they carry? Less than you would think. A blanket if they had one, a change of socks, maybe a tin cup, a spoon, a bit of bread, a jackknife, matches, a photograph, a letter, an address written on paper. Some carried bindles, the cloth bundles tied to sticks that became visual shorthand for the wandering poor, though many simply used sacks. Good shoes mattered more than almost anything. A man could survive hunger longer than he could survive ruined feet if he had to keep moving. Shoes wore out quickly on roads, in yards, in camps, along ballast and cinders. A hole in a sole was not a minor inconvenience. It could decide whether you reached the next town. Between rides, people gathered in places often called hobo jungles. These were informal camps near railroad lines, usually outside town, close enough to the tracks to catch a train, and far enough from respectable streets to avoid immediate police attention. A jungle might be a few men under trees or a large shifting settlement with cooking fires, makeshift shelters, and rules of its own. The word jungle can mislead us. These were not lawless tangles in the simple sense. Many had customs. Clean up after yourself. Share firewood if you can. Do not steal from another man's bedroll. Leave something in the pot for the next person if you have anything to spare. Experienced hobos sometimes enforced these rules because survival on the road required at least a small amount of trust. Food in these camps was plain and uncertain. Mulligan stew was a common name for whatever could be combined in a pot. Potatoes, onions, scraps of meat, carrots, canned goods, leftovers begged from houses, anything edible. One man might contribute a turnip, another a handful of flour, another nothing but labour-gathering wood. Coffee, if available, was boiled strong. Tin cans became cookware. A flattened can could serve as a pan. A wire could hold something over flame. People who had once eaten at tables now crouched by fires, blowing steam off whatever the group had managed to assemble. Around those fires, information mattered almost as much as food. Which towns had work? Which towns jailed transients? Which rail yards were watched closely? Which farmers might hire hands? Which missions offered beds? Which roads had been flooded? Which police chiefs hated outsiders? These camps also had a language. Not always the elaborate hobo code that later popular culture loved to exaggerate, though signs and marks did exist in various forms. More important was spoken knowledge, passed from person to person. A decent woman at the White House gives sandwiches, dogs at the next farm. The jail in that county gives breakfast if you ask for a night's lodging, but the deputy will make you break rocks in the morning. Do not go near the yard on Sunday because the bull there drinks Saturday night and swings hard the next day. The country became a map of warnings. For people without money, information was currency. But even the jungle was not outside the law. Local authorities often raided camps, burned shelters, moved men along, arrested those who lingered. Towns feared transients for reasons both practical and imagined. A sudden group of unemployed strangers could strain relief resources, frighten residents, and raise concerns about theft or disorder. Some fears had basis. Hungry people sometimes stole. Some camps had violence. But much of the fear came from what transients represented. They were visible proof that the economic order had failed. A town could ignore unemployment when it stayed indoors. It could not ignore men boiling scraps beside the tracks. There is a small cruelty in the phrase "move along." It sounds so simple. The police tell a man to move along and the problem appears to leave. But where is he supposed to go? The next town may do the same thing. The town after that too. Movement becomes compulsory, then criminal, then compulsory again. A man without work is told to search for work, but the act of travelling without money makes him a trespasser, a vagrant, a suspicious person. He cannot stay, and he cannot properly go. He is pushed from place to place by a country that needs him to be elsewhere, but has no elsewhere prepared. The railroad made this contradiction plain. America's economy had been built in part on mobility. Go west, follow opportunity, move to the mill town, take the harvest job, join the crew. The national mythology praised the person who moved in search of better chances. But during the Depression, when millions attempted movement without the money to do it respectably, the same act became threatening. A man with a ticket was a traveller. A man in a boxcar was a trespasser. A family in an automobile looking for work might be migrants. A boy under a freight car was a delinquent. The difference was not always purpose, it was payment. For boys, the rail life could begin with excitement and become frightening very quickly. A train leaving the yard under darkness might feel like escape. The town falls away. The wheels settle into rhythm. The air changes. For a few miles there is relief simply in not being at the table where everyone is counting food. Then the cold comes through the cracks. Smoke and cinders sting the eyes. Older men cough. Someone tells a story about a boy who lost a leg jumping from a train near Omaha, or a man found frozen in a refrigerator car. The train does not care who rides it. It does not slow because a person is hungry. It does not soften its iron edges because a rider is young. Accidents were common enough that fear of them became part of the road's education. People fell between cars. They misjudged speed when jumping. They were struck in yards. They froze. They suffocated in sealed cars. They were crushed by shifting freight. A boxcar could seem like shelter until the door was closed from outside. A refrigerated car could become a trap. A flat car could expose a rider to weather for hours. Riding on top could bring wind, soot, and the danger of bridges. Riding underneath, on rods or brake beams, was so dangerous that even experienced men treated it with respect. Yet people did it because danger measured against certainty of hunger can begin to look like a bargain. What were they looking for? Work, mostly, or the rumour of work. Harvest still needed hands in some places, though wages were low and competition intense. Farms might hire temporary labour, Road projects might take men. Docks, lumber camps, mines, factories, and construction sites might offer a day, a week, a meal, nothing. A rider could travel hundreds of miles to find that the job had never existed, or had been filled before he arrived. This cycle of rumour and disappointment wore people down. Hope became portable but fragile. It could fit in a pocket like an address, and it could be ruined in one sentence at a gate. No hiring. Some men carried letters of recommendation from former employers, folded and refolded until the creases tore. These letters were relics from a world that believed credentials could still open doors. To present one after weeks on the road must have been painful. The man handing it over might be dirty, unshaven, thinner than he had been, but the paper said he had once been reliable, skilled, punctual, sober, useful. Employers did not always doubt him. They simply had no place to put him. The letter went back into the pocket, less powerful each time. As more people rode, communities along the rails developed routines for handling them. Some towns offered a meal and a night in jail, not as punishment exactly, but as rough shelter. Some required men to work for food, chopping wood, cleaning streets, breaking stone. Some refused all help to outsiders. Some put men on the next train whether they wanted to go or not. A local jail could become an unofficial lodging house for transients, but accepting that shelter meant accepting arrest or near arrest as part of survival. Again the boundary blurred. A man might commit no theft, threaten no one, damage nothing, and still pass through the machinery of law because he needed a floor to sleep on. Women rode too, though in smaller numbers and often under different dangers. Some travelled with husbands or families. Some travelled alone, disguising themselves when possible, avoiding camps where men gathered, taking risks that were not always recorded because the public image of the rail rider became overwhelmingly male. Women who moved through this world faced hunger, arrest, assault, and moral judgment of a harsher kind. A man on the road could be pitied as unemployed. A woman on the road was more likely to be treated as fallen, suspect, or unprotected in ways that made every encounter more dangerous. Their stories appear less often, but their absence from the common picture should not make us forget them. Race shaped the rails too. Black Americans had long used rail movement in search of work and escape from the worst constraints of local economies, but the Depression intensified already severe discrimination. Black riders faced not only the general dangers of trespassing and vagrancy enforcement, but also the racial violence and exclusion of towns where a white transient might be warned and a black transient might be jailed, beaten, or worse. In the South especially, rail travel without protection could be perilous in ways that white riders did not have to calculate with the same intensity. Even in northern and western states, relief and employment opportunities often favoured white workers first. The road was hard for everyone, but it was not equally hard. The people left at home experienced the rails differently. A mother whose son had gone out looking for work might listen for trains at night and hate the sound. Trains that once meant travel now meant uncertainty. Was he on one? Was he safe? Had he eaten? Had he been arrested? Would a letter come? Mail from the road was irregular. A postcard might arrive weeks after it was sent. A boy could write, "Doing fine, found work soon, do not worry," while sleeping hungry outside a yard. Families learned not to trust reassurance completely. They also learned to treasure it, because the alternative was imagining the worst with no evidence either way. There is something very particular about the criminalisation of looking for work by rail. These riders were not trying to steal the freight in most cases. They were not trying to damage equipment. They were trying to move through a country that had work in some places, food in some places, rumours in every place, and no affordable way for the unemployed to reach any of it. Yet because the train belonged to a company and the ride had not been paid for, the act became illegal. This does not mean the railroads had no legitimate concerns, but history becomes revealing precisely where legitimate concerns collide with human desperation. The yard bull with a club and the boy in the boxcar were both products of the same failed economy. One was paid to protect property, The other was risking his body because he had none. As the depression deepened, the sight of men on trains became part of the national atmosphere. People saw them from crossings, from depot platforms, from fields near the tracks. A freight rolled past and faces appeared briefly in the openings. Men crouched in doorways. Boys waved sometimes, because boys will wave even from danger if someone is watching. Then the train moved on, carrying them toward another town that might not want them. The image disturbed settled people. It suggested that rootedness itself could fail. If those men had once had homes, then home was not as permanent as it looked. If those boys had mothers, then family love could not always keep children indoors. If those riders were criminals, then crime had begun to look uncomfortably like misfortune in motion. In some places, aid organisations and reformers tried to understand the transient crisis rather than only punish it. They counted riders, interviewed boys, opened shelters, urged government action. They warned that young people on the road were learning theft, cynicism and distrust because society had offered them little else. This concern was not sentimental. A teenager who spent 2 years being chased from towns, beaten by railroad police, sleeping hungry, and stealing food when necessary did not return unchanged. The road could educate him away from ordinary authority. If the law appeared mostly as a club, a locked door, or a jail cell for the crime of having nowhere to go, why would he later respect it? The Depression did not only produce immediate crime, it shaped attitudes toward law that could last long after wages returned. There were also moments of decency that deserved to be kept in the picture. A brakeman who pretended not to see a boy in an empty car. A farmer's wife who handed out sandwiches at the back porch. A small-town officer who let a tired man sleep in a cell without booking him and gave him coffee before sending him on. An older hobo who warned a newcomer not to jump from a fast train. A group in a jungle that shared stew with someone who had nothing to contribute. These acts did not solve the crisis, but they prevented the world from becoming entirely hard. Survival often depended on such small mercies, unofficial and unrecorded. Still, mercy was not a system. It could not be relied upon. A man could be fed one evening and jailed the next. A boy could be ignored by one railroad employee and beaten by another. A town could offer a bed in January and expel all transients in February. The road had no stable rules except uncertainty. That uncertainty itself pushed people toward more rule-breaking. If you do not know whether the next town will feed you, you may steal before arriving. If you fear your blanket will be taken, you may take someone else's. If every authority treats you as a criminal, you may eventually decide there is little point in preserving the distinction, and yet many did preserve it. This is worth emphasizing because it keeps the story honest. Most people riding the rails were not violent criminals. Many were deeply concerned with remaining decent under indecent conditions. They asked for work before asking for food. They paid when they could. They avoided stealing from other poor people. They wrote home if they had postage. They washed in creeks, mended clothes, looked for jobs, attended mission services for a meal, and tried to keep themselves within some moral boundary even while trespassing across state lines in boxcars. Their lives had become illegal in pieces, but they did not necessarily think of themselves as outside society. They thought of themselves as trying to get back in. Picture that 16-year-old again, after several weeks on the rails. He's thinner now. His hands are dirty in a way that washing does not fully fix. He has learned to sleep lightly. He has learned that adults can be kind and dangerous, sometimes in the same day. He has learned that a town may look peaceful from the tracks and still have no place for him. He has learned how to climb into a boxcar without panicking, how to hide when a yard bull passes, how to eat slowly when food is scarce so the stomach does not revolt. He has learned that looking for work can make a person a trespasser before he ever reaches the job. Maybe he finds a day's work unloading crates. Maybe he earns 50 cents and spends part of it on food, part on postage, part on nothing because there is nothing left. Maybe he writes home, "I am all right. Work is around. Do not worry." Maybe he believes it while writing. Maybe he does not. Then the job ends, or never begins, and he returns to the tracks with other men who have heard of something farther west, farther south, farther anywhere. The train is waiting, or rather it is not waiting at all. It is simply there, owned by someone else, moving according to schedules that do not include him. He climbs aboard anyway. That is the heart of this part of the Depression story. Movement became both necessary and forbidden. The country told its unemployed to seek work, then punished them for the ways they could afford to seek it. A man standing still was idle. A man walking was a vagrant. A man riding a freight was a trespasser. A man asking at a back door was a nuisance. A man taking food was a thief. The respectable paths narrowed until many people could not fit through them anymore. So they slipped through side doors, under fences, into rail yards and onto trains, carrying with them the remains of a belief that somewhere, if they could just reach it, there might be work enough to make them ordinary again. The rails did not always lead to work. Often they led to another line, another camp, another police warning, another meal made from scraps, another night in clothes stiff with dirt. But they did lead people into a wider world of depression survival, where the small thefts of bread and coal became part of a larger underground economy of need. Along the tracks, in the camps, near markets, behind warehouses, and in neighbourhoods where families still tried to keep curtains clean while cupboards emptied, ordinary Americans were learning which goods could be taken, which risks were worth it, which laws would be enforced, and which ones might bend if enough hungry people stood together. The next step in that story is not glamorous either. It is not a headline crime. It is coal in a sack, milk from a doorstep, apples from a cart, and the everyday objects that became evidence when staying alive began to leave fingerprints. A sack of coal does not look like the beginning of a crime story. It looks heavy. It looks ordinary. It looks like something that belongs beside a stove, in a basement bin, in the corner of a tenement kitchen where the floor is always a little gritty no matter how often someone sweeps it. Coal was not dramatic. It did not glitter. It did not tempt people the way money tempts people. No one dreamed of becoming rich by carrying coal home in a torn sack under cover of darkness. And yet in the early years of the Great Depression, coal became one of the objects around which the meaning of crime began to change. A lump of it could be property. A lump of it could be heat. A lump of it could be evidence in court. A lump of it could be the difference between a child sleeping under blankets and a child lying awake with feet that never quite warmed. This is the kind of crime that rarely survives well in popular memory because it's too plain to become legend. A man stealing coal does not make an exciting poster. A woman taking milk from a doorstep does not become a symbol of rebellion. A boy slipping an apple into his coat does not inspire songs unless the story is softened and made charming later. But in the Depression, these small thefts were everywhere, and that is exactly why they matter. They show us the crisis at its closest range, not in speeches, not in election results, not in the rise and fall of banks, but in the daily collision between hunger, cold, property, shame, and the law. Think first about heat. In a modern home, warmth is usually hidden inside systems. A thermostat on the wall, a furnace in a basement, pipes, vents, wires, bills, automatic payments. The physical material of heat is out of sight for many people. In the Depression, especially in working-class neighbourhoods and poorer homes, heat often had a visible form. Coal in a bucket, coal in a bin, coal dust on a sleeve, coal smoke over a city street. Families knew exactly how much warmth remained because they could look at it. They could count it by the scuttle. They could hear it being shoveled. They could feel the weight of it when a child was sent down to bring some up. Running low was not an abstract worry. It was a visible shrinking pile. Now place that shrinking pile in January. A cold apartment. Windows that leak air. Children wearing coats indoors. A stove that has to be coaxed carefully because wasting fuel in the morning may mean no fire at night. The mother has already moved the beds closer together. She has put extra clothing over the children. She may have stuffed newspaper into cracks around the windows. The father has checked his pockets again, though there is nothing in them that was not there the first time. He knows the coal dealer will not extend more credit. He knows the landlord is already impatient. He also knows that near the railroad yard, coal spills from cars. Not always much. Not enough to matter to the company in any visible way, but enough to matter to a household whose stove is cold. So he goes out after dark. That walk matters. He is not yet the person returning with stolen coal. He is the person walking toward the decision. The street is cold. The lamps, if the neighbourhood has them, throw weak light on pavement or frozen mud. Other men may be going the same way, though they do not speak of it directly. Some carry sacks, some carry buckets, some send older boys because boys can move quickly and attract a different kind of sympathy, though not always enough to protect them. Near the tracks, the ground changes underfoot. Cinders, gravel, iron. The smell of coal smoke and oil. Freight cars stand in the yard like dark walls. Everything there belongs to someone. The rails, the cars, the coal, the space between them. A man entering without permission has already crossed one line before he picks up anything at all. Railroad companies understood coal picking as theft, and from their perspective it was not difficult to explain why. Coal was valuable. Rail yards were dangerous. Crowds of scavengers interfered with operations. People climbing around cars could be injured. Theft of loose coal could become theft from cars. The company had every reason, legally and commercially, to keep people out. Railroad police chased coal pickers, confiscated sacks, made arrests, and sometimes used force. The law was clear. But the moral scene was not clear at all to the man with cold children at home. He was not picturing a ledger. He was picturing the stove. The first handful might be loose on the ground, scattered where it fell during loading. That could almost be explained away in the mind. Waste. Spillage. No one will miss it. Then perhaps he finds larger pieces near a car, or reaches where he should not reach, or climbs where he should not climb. Small thefts have a way of growing by inches because the need that sent a person there is not symbolic. It has a quantity. One bucket may not be enough. One sack may warm one night, but not tomorrow. Need asks for a little more. Fear answers with hurry. And all the while there is the chance of a lantern beam, a shout, a running step on gravel. If he is caught, what does he say? I was stealing? Probably not. I needed coal. My children were cold. There was some on the ground. I meant no harm. These are not legal defences in the simple sense, but they are human explanations, and Depression America was full of them. Police officers, judges, guards, shopkeepers, and neighbours heard such explanations constantly. Some hardened themselves against them because hearing too many would make enforcement impossible. Others let people go or looked away or gave warnings because they knew the difference between a thief for profit and a father with a sack. The Depression did not abolish punishment, but it made punishment more uncomfortable to watch. Milk carried a different kind of pressure because it was associated with children. Coal was heat. Bread was hunger. Milk was the small daily promise that children would be nourished, that breakfast would still have something gentle in it, that the household had not fallen completely. In cities and towns across America, milk delivery placed temptation right at the edge of respectability. Bottles appeared on porches and outside doors in the early morning, left there by milkmen who moved through neighbourhoods before many families were awake. The system depended on trust. A household paid the dairy delivered, and the bottle waited until someone opened the door. But hunger and poverty attack systems of trust because they put visible goods in front of people who can no longer access them properly. Picture a boy walking to school before breakfast, though breakfast has been coffee for the adults and bread for the children, and not enough of either. He passes a porch with 2 bottles of milk. The cream has risen pale and thick at the top. The glass is cold. No one is watching. Perhaps he keeps walking. Perhaps he slows. Perhaps he thinks of a younger sister. Perhaps he thinks only of his own stomach. The bottle is not locked away. It is not guarded. It is there, so close that taking it takes less than a second. The act is small, but afterward the whole morning changes. If he drinks it himself, he is relieved and ashamed. If he carries it home, he becomes useful and guilty at once. If he is caught, he is not simply hungry anymore, he is a thief. Milk theft was especially troubling because it violated the domestic boundary. A stolen apple from a cart was public. Coal from a yard belonged to a company. Milk from a doorstep belonged to a household, and that household might be struggling too. The person who ordered the milk may have children of their own. The theft passed hunger from one door to another. That is one of the painful truths of depression survival. Need did not always take from abundance. Sometimes it took from another fragile person. This is where sympathy becomes harder. It is easier to understand stealing from a railroad yard than stealing from a neighbour's breakfast. But hunger does not always choose targets according to moral philosophy. It chooses what is near. Apples were different again. They stood in windows and carts and market stalls with a kind of bright cruelty. Fruit is not just food. It is colour. In years when meals became beige and brown, bread, beans, potatoes, gravy, coffee, thin soup, an apple looked almost festive. During the Depression, unemployed men famously sold apples on city streets, a practice encouraged in some places as a way for jobless people to earn small sums with dignity. The image became one of the era's symbols, a man in a coat and cap standing beside a crate, offering apples for a few cents each to pedestrians who might buy as much from pity as appetite. But apples could also be stolen, and fruit theft occupied that uneasy border between childish mischief and adult desperation. A boy lifting an apple from a cart might have been punished lightly in better times, scolded, chased, maybe cuffed by the vendor if caught. During the Depression, the same act carried a different weight because everyone knew why it might be happening. But the vendor was not necessarily comfortable. He had paid for the apples, or he owed the wholesaler. Or he was himself unemployed, selling fruit on consignment to keep from standing in a bread line. When a hungry person steals from another hungry person trying to sell, the crime has no clean villain. It is the economy turning poor people against each other over objects too small to carry the blame. This is where the Depression becomes hard to narrate honestly, because the suffering was not evenly noble. People helped each other. They also cheated each other. They shared food and stole food. They organised rent protests and fought over scraps. A woman might feed a stranger at the back door on Monday and refuse another on Tuesday because she had nothing left. A grocer might forgive a debt for a customer he knew and call the police on a stranger. A policeman might let one boy go and arrest another. The crisis produced generosity, but it also exhausted generosity. And when generosity ran out, law took over, often in its bluntest form. Small thefts often began in places where goods moved. Rail yards, docks, markets, delivery routes, warehouses, farms near roads. These were the pressure points of the Depression city and countryside because they exposed the contradiction of the era. Goods existed. People needed them. Yet money, employment and credit no longer connected the two reliably. This contradiction could make ownership feel unreal to those outside it. A crate of food left overnight behind a store seemed different from food in a family pantry. A field after harvest seemed open to gleaning, even if the owner disagreed. Coal scattered by tracks seemed abandoned until a railroad policeman appeared to insist that it was not. The law saw title. Hunger saw use. Farm theft had its own long history, and the Depression gave it new urgency. In rural areas, people took corn from fields, potatoes from storage, chickens from coops, fruit from orchards, sometimes even livestock if desperation or criminal opportunity grew large enough. Farmers were often in desperate shape themselves, which made rural theft especially bitter. A farmer losing money on every crop still had to protect that crop from people who had none. A chicken stolen from a farm could mean one less source of eggs, one less Sunday dinner, one more insult in a life already full of them. Rural communities might sympathise with hunger, but they did not always tolerate theft because they understood too well the labour behind each object. An apple in an orchard was not simply an apple. Someone had pruned, watched, sprayed, harvested, stored, and hoped for a price. In cities, shoplifting rose in forms that often centred on food and small necessities. Bread, canned goods, soap, cloth, stockings, baby items. The goods tell the story. These were not jewel robberies. They were attempts to keep households functioning. A woman might take thread because mending was impossible without it. A man might steal a razor blade because job hunting required a shaved face. A girl might take stockings because bare legs or torn stockings could mark poverty publicly. Respectability itself required materials, and when people could not buy those materials, some stole them not for luxury, but to remain employable, marriageable, decent-looking, unashamed. Poverty is not only lack, it is exposure. There was a phrase people used then and still use now, keeping up appearances. In the Depression, appearances had practical value. A man looking for work needed to look like a man who could be hired. A woman asking for credit needed to look reliable. Children at school needed to look cared for enough not to draw attention. Clean collars, brushed shoes, patched clothing, combed hair. These details were defences against judgment. When the resources to maintain them disappeared, families improvised. They turned collars, darned socks, dyed old fabric, cut down adult clothing for children, polished worn shoes until the cracks still showed. Sometimes they stole small things that helped preserve the appearance of not needing to steal. That is one of the sad ironies of the period. Courts saw these people in fragments, a charge, a name, an item taken, a value assigned, 1 loaf of bread, 2 quarts of milk, coal valued at 50 cents, apples valued at a dime. A courtroom reduces desperation to entries because that is what courts are built to do. They process acts. They do not always process the months leading up to them. A judge might be merciful, but mercy depended on the judge, the defendant, the town, the race and reputation of the accused, and the mood of the public. There was no single Depression justice. There were thousands of local judgments, some humane, some indifferent, some openly harsh. Race and ethnicity mattered at every step. White families who stole from need were more likely in many places to be described as unfortunate, especially if they were local and known. Black Americans, Mexican Americans, immigrants and transient workers often encountered less sympathy and more suspicion. The same stolen food could be interpreted differently depending on who carried it. A white boy might be a hungry lad. A black boy might be treated as a criminal threat. A local mother might be pitied. An immigrant mother might be accused of dishonesty. The Depression did not suspend the prejudices of American life. It intensified many of them because scarcity makes people guard belonging more fiercely. Neighbourhood reputation also shaped outcomes. If a family had once been stable, church-going, employed and known, neighbours might quietly excuse a small act or help before the law became involved. If a person was already outside the circle of respectability, the same act could confirm every suspicion. This is why the fall from respectability was so frightening. It was not only the loss of money, it was the loss of interpretation. When people believe you're decent, they explain your mistakes kindly. When they decide you're not, even need looks like character. There were families who tried to pay back what they had taken. A woman might later leave coins with a shopkeeper anonymously. A man who stole coal might return months later as a customer and buy more than he needed. A boy who took apples might remember the vendor's face for the rest of his life. These gestures rarely entered official records, but they matter because they show how many small thefts remained morally alive inside the people who committed them. They had not stopped believing theft was wrong. They had entered a period when wrong things sometimes seemed necessary, and necessary things could still leave a mark. theft was not the only survival crime. People scavenged, resold, bartered, brewed, gambled, forged, and lied. Prohibition had only recently ended in 1933, and before its repeal, illegal liquor offered a way for some families to earn money outside the law. Not everyone involved was a gangster. Some were farmers distilling spirits, women selling homemade drink, workers moving bottles for cash, small operators trying to survive in a dry economy that had already taught Americans to treat certain laws as negotiable. When legal employment disappeared, illegal markets became more attractive, not because everyone wanted danger, but because danger sometimes paid when respectability did not. Scrap collection became another grey world. Metal, rags, bottles, wood, paper, anything that could be sold or reused had value. People searched dumps, alleys, construction sites, rail yards, abandoned buildings. Taking discarded material could be legal or tolerated. Taking material not yet discarded could be theft. The distinction was not always obvious to someone hungry enough to pick through refuse. A pile of boards near a lot might be waste to one person, inventory to another. A child pulling copper wire from a place he should not be could become a delinquent in the eyes of police and a contributor in the eyes of his family. Poverty trains people to see value where others see debris. The language of crime did not always fit these acts. A criminal, in the public imagination, was supposed to be someone who chose wrongdoing against the order of society. But what was the order of society doing in 1932? It had closed factories. It had allowed banks to fail. It had permitted families to be evicted in winter. It had food rotting or unsold while people stood in lines. It had asked local charities to handle national collapse. When society itself appeared disorderly, the person breaking a rule to get milk or coal could seem less like an enemy of order than a symptom of its absence. Still, the victims of small theft had their own truth. The grocer robbed of food was not responsible for the banking system. The farmer losing chickens did not cause unemployment in Detroit. The milk customer whose bottle disappeared had not closed the factory. Crime spreads pain sideways. That is part of its damage. It takes suffering created by large forces and redistributes it among people close enough to reach. The Depression made this painfully common. A family hurt by the economy might hurt another family by stealing from them. That second family, now short, might refuse credit to someone else. Hardship moved from hand to hand like a debt no one had agreed to carry. There is a scene worth imagining because it must have happened in many forms. A small grocery late in the evening. Shelves not full, but not empty. The owner behind the counter, tired and watching carefully because theft has become more common. A woman comes in with a child. She asks the price of flour, though she knows it. She asks about credit, though she knows the answer. The grocer shakes his head, perhaps gently, perhaps not. He has already written her name in his book too many times. She walks the aisle slowly, touching nothing at first. The child sees crackers, milk, apples, canned peaches maybe, something bright and impossible. The grocer turns to help another customer or to check a drawer. The woman's hand moves. One small item goes into a pocket or under a coat. Her face does not change because faces learn discipline in hard times. She leaves. Perhaps the grocer sees and says nothing. Perhaps he calls after her. Perhaps the child sees too and learns something no parent ever wants to teach. That lesson was not simply how to steal. It was that adults could be trapped. Children in Depression households learned that rules had contexts. They learned that honesty was praised, but hunger could overrule praise. They learned that police were not always protectors, that stores were not always welcoming, that charity could come with shame, that property mattered differently depending on who had it and who needed it. Some children carried these lessons into adulthood as caution. Some carried them as resentment. Some carried them as thrift so intense it puzzled their own children decades later. The person who saves every jar, every nail, every scrap of string maybe remembering a world where every object could become survival. By the mid-1930s, New Deal programs began to change some of the conditions that had pushed people toward petty crime. Work relief, public jobs, food programs, and broader federal responsibility did not end the Depression immediately, and they did not reach everyone equally. But they altered the sense that families had been left entirely alone with impossible choices. A man earning wages through a work program did not need to climb into a coal yard. A family receiving aid might avoid stealing food. A boy who could remain in school was less likely to drift toward trains and backdoor survival. Policy did not make people moral. It gave morality more room to operate by reducing the pressure that had been crushing it. But before those systems reached into every place they needed to reach, small theft remained part of the hidden economy of survival. Coal in sacks, milk bottles missing from porches, apples slipped from carts, bread from bakery doors, vegetables from fields, cloth, soap, thread, shoes, and fuel. These objects were small enough to vanish quickly and important enough to change a day. They turned ordinary Americans into lawbreakers not by making them love crime, but by making legal life too narrow for need to pass through. And as these small crimes multiplied, the country's attitude toward larger crimes began to shift in ways that startled observers even at the time. If stealing coal from a railroad could be understood, what about robbing a bank that had foreclosed on farms? If taking milk was wrong but hunger explained it, what about men who said they were taking back from institutions the public had come to despise? This was dangerous thinking, and it could excuse terrible violence, but it did not emerge from nowhere. It grew in the same soil as the stolen apple and the coal sack carried home at night. By the time bank robbers began appearing in newspapers as bold, smiling figures with fast cars and guns, many Americans had already spent years watching the law defend property more reliably than it defended families. That did not make the robbers heroes, not really, but it helped explain why some people were ready to cheer when the banks for once looked frightened too. By the time the bank robbers became famous, Americans had already learned to dislike banks in a way that was deeper than politics and more personal than theory. A bank was no longer just a building with marble counters and brass rails and men in suits speaking in careful voices. For many people by 1933, a bank was the place where savings had vanished. It was the office that held the mortgage note. It was the institution that could send a notice, call a loan, refuse an extension, close its doors, or sell the farm where a family had buried parents and raised children. This did not mean every banker was cruel. Many small-town bankers suffered too. Some lost everything when their own banks failed. Some had known their customers for decades and hated enforcing rules that ruined neighbours. But public anger does not always separate institutions from individuals neatly. In the Depression, the bank became a symbol, and symbols are easier to hate than people. So when a man with a gun walked into a bank and walked out with cash, a strange thing sometimes happened in the American imagination. The act was illegal, violent, frightening and dangerous. Clerks had guns pointed at them, tellers trembled, customers lay on floors, policemen and bystanders were sometimes shot. Real people died in this world, and it would be dishonest to soften that. But outside the bank, in pool halls, barbershops, boarding houses, farm kitchens and city streets, there were Americans who heard the news and felt something other than simple outrage. They felt a quick, guilty satisfaction. For once the bank had been afraid. For once the man behind the counter had been ordered to raise his hands. For once money had moved in the wrong direction. That does not make the bank robbers heroes. It makes the public mood worth examining. During the early 1930s, the United States entered what newspapers and lawmen would soon describe as the public enemy era. Names moved across the country with astonishing speed. John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, Babyface Nelson, Alvin Karpis, the Barker Karpis Gang, Machine Gun Kelly. These names sound almost unreal now. partly because they have been repeated so often in movies, songs, pulp stories, and documentaries that the people behind them have become blurred. But in their own time, they were not distant legends. They were current events. Their photographs appeared in newspapers. Their escapes were described in detail. Their deaths were reported with the urgency usually reserved for war and disaster. Americans followed them because crime had become entertainment, fear, resentment, and fantasy all mixed together. The technology of the period helped make them famous. Cars were faster than many police departments could handle. A robber could cross county lines, state lines, and jurisdictional boundaries before local law enforcement even understood what had happened. Telephones existed, of course, but communication between departments was uneven. Roads had improved enough to make quick travel possible, but policing had not yet fully adjusted to criminals who treated the Midwest like a map of escape routes. A gang could rob a bank in Indiana, hide in Illinois, move through Wisconsin, and turn up in Ohio before the story had finished printing. The country was connected enough for fame, but not yet coordinated enough for easy pursuit. Newspapers turned that gap into drama. Editors knew readers wanted detail. What car did they drive? What did they wear? Did the outlaw smile? Did he leave a joke behind? Did he leap over the counter? Did he spare a customer? Did he humiliate the police? A bank robbery could be reported as crime, but also as a scene. The robbers became characters whether they deserved to or not. A man like Dillinger understood this. He had a talent for performance. Witnesses often described him as calm, quick, sometimes almost polite in the middle of terror. He knew the value of an image, the wide grin, the tilted hat, the bold escape, the sense that he was not merely stealing, but staging something for a country that had grown tired of feeling powerless. Dillinger was born in Indianapolis in 1903, not into the glamorous criminal world that later surrounded his name, but into ordinary Midwestern life. His early path involved trouble, poor decisions, and a prison sentence after a robbery committed when he was young. Prison mattered because it connected him with men who knew more serious crime than he did. When he emerged into the Depression world, he entered a country very different from the one into which he had been born. Banks had failed, jobs were scarce, police departments were stretched, people were angry. His robberies and escapes turned him into something larger than a thief in the public mind. He became a kind of walking insult to authority. The most famous part of the Dillinger story may be the way people reacted to him. Not everyone admired him. Many feared him, and many wanted him caught. But there were also crowds that gathered when he appeared in custody. Crowds that treated him less like a murderer and robber than a celebrity. People smiled at him. Women sent letters. Strangers came to see him as if catching a glimpse of his face offered participation in the national drama. When he escaped from jail, newspapers fed the astonishment. When he was cornered, the public wanted every detail. When he died outside the Biograph Theatre in Chicago in July 1934, shot by federal agents after watching a movie, people came to the scene and dipped handkerchiefs and newspapers in his blood. That detail is disturbing, and it should be. It tells us that the outlaw had become an object of fascination so intense that even his death was treated as something to collect. But the fascination did not come only from his charm or newspaper coverage. It came from resentment already waiting for a figure to attach itself to. Banks had become villains in many households. Police had become eviction enforcers in some neighbourhoods. Courts had become places where property rights were upheld more visibly than human need. The federal government, before the New Deal began to reach deeply into daily life, seemed distant or slow. So when an outlaw embarrassed banks and escaped police, some people experienced the story as revenge by proxy. They did not have to approve of murder to enjoy the humiliation of institutions they blamed. Human beings are capable of that contradiction. The Depression gave them many chances to practice it. Pretty Boy Floyd occupied a similar space in public imagination, especially in parts of Oklahoma and the Midwest. Charles Arthur Floyd was no simple folk hero, no matter how later stories softened him. He was associated with robberies and violence, and law enforcement pursued him as a dangerous criminal. Yet in poor farming communities, stories circulated that he destroyed mortgage papers during bank robberies, freeing farmers from debt. Whether such stories were true in specific cases matters less than the fact that people wanted them to be true. The legend reveals the desire. Farmers losing land wanted to imagine someone walking into the place that held their debt and turning that paper into nothing. The dream was not really of theft, it was of cancellation. There is something revealing about the mortgage paper story because it shows how the public tried to separate acceptable targets from unacceptable ones. A robber who took from a struggling storekeeper was just a thief. A robber who attacked a bank could be imagined as striking upward. Again, the reality was messier. Bank employees were not all powerful men in corner offices. Tellers were wage workers. Customers inside could be ordinary people. Bullets did not distinguish between institution and individual. But resentment simplified the scene. In the public mind, the robber faced the bank, and the bank represented the system. In a crisis, people often need symbols more than precision. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow added another layer because they were young, photogenic, reckless, and doomed in a way that newspapers could not resist. Their actual criminal career was brutal, and often far less glamorous than the later legend. They robbed small stores and gas stations more often than banks. They killed lawmen and civilians. They lived in stolen cars, safe houses, back roads, and constant fear. They were frequently hungry, injured, exhausted, and dirty. The photographs that helped build their legend, especially the staged images found by police after the Joplin hideout shootout in 1933, made them look playful and daring. Bonnie with a cigar in her mouth, Clyde with weapons, young outlaws posing as if crime were a costume. Newspapers seized on these images because the country wanted faces. But behind the images was a life that ended in a hail of gunfire on a Louisiana road in May 1934, their bodies torn apart by bullets in an ambush that was itself treated by the public as spectacle. It is worth pausing here because Bonnie and Clyde show the danger of turning depression criminals into symbols too quickly. They were not stealing coal for warmth. They were not taking milk for children. They were armed fugitives who left grieving families behind them, yet they became part of the same emotional landscape because their defiance occurred in a country already disillusioned with authority. Many Americans did not cheer them in the same way they cheered a bank robber who seemed to target financial institutions. Some feared them plainly. Still, their youth, their romance, and their deaths allowed the public to convert them into something more usable than the facts. The Depression was full of trapped people. Bonnie and Clyde looked, from a distance, like people who refused to be trapped, even though the refusal destroyed them and others. Babyface Nelson, whose real name was Lester Gillis, stripped away much of the charm. He was violent, volatile, and feared even by those who understood the outlaw world. His nickname made him sound almost comic, but there was nothing gentle in the record of his crimes. He killed federal agents and died after a gun battle in 1934. Yet even men like Nelson benefited from the same media atmosphere that made criminals famous. A name, a face, a nickname, a fast car, a machine gun, a dramatic death. These ingredients created notoriety, and notoriety could be mistaken for importance. The public consumed these stories because they were frightening and exciting, but also because they provided a simpler drama than the Depression itself. A bank robbery had a beginning, middle, and end. The Depression did not. The government noticed the problem. Public fascination with outlaws was not merely embarrassing. It threatened the authority of law enforcement at a time when the country badly needed confidence in institutions. J. Edgar Hoover, who led what became the Federal Bureau of Investigation, understood the value of publicity as well as any outlaw did. The pursuit of public enemies became part of building a modern federal law enforcement image. Agents were presented as disciplined, scientific, relentless, and national in reach. The answer to criminals who exploited local boundaries. Fingerprints, files, coordinated communication, federal statutes, interstate pursuit, all of these helped create the idea of the modern federal crime fighter. The outlaws made themselves famous, but the Bureau used their fame to make itself necessary. This transformation mattered. Before the 1930s, many crimes were handled locally, and federal authority in ordinary crime was more limited. But bank robbery, kidnapping, interstate flight, stolen cars crossing state lines, and attacks on federal officers pushed the national government into a larger role. The Lindbergh kidnapping in 1932, although separate from the bank robber mythology, intensified public concern about modern crime crossing local boundaries. The Kansas City massacre in 1933, when lawmen and a prisoner were killed near Union Station, shocked officials and helped justify stronger federal action. Crime became national news, and national news demanded national response. The same decade that expanded federal responsibility for work, relief, banking, and agriculture also expanded federal policing. But there is an uncomfortable symmetry here. Many Americans distrusted banks and resented local authorities, but they also feared disorder. They might laugh when a robber embarrassed a bank, but they did not want gunfire in their own town. They might admire a clean escape, but they wanted roads safe for their families. They might believe a sheriff was too quick to carry out evictions, but still call him if a stranger broke into the house. The Depression did not make Americans anarchists. It made them conflicted. They wanted justice from institutions they did not fully trust. They wanted law, but they wanted it to recognize suffering. They wanted criminals punished, unless the criminals seemed to be punishing someone they hated more. This conflict showed up in small conversations. In a barbershop, one man might say Dillinger had nerve. Another might reply that tellers had families too. Someone else might say the banks had robbed the people first. A fourth might remind them that bullets do not care about politics. The debate was not always formal, but it was real. People were trying to decide where sympathy ended. Hunger theft was one thing. Bank robbery was another. Murder was something else again. The lines shifted depending on the story, the victim, the teller, the newspaper, the mood of the listener, and the listener's own experience with debt. For farmers facing foreclosure, the bank robber could appear as a distorted version of the crowd at a foreclosure auction. In both cases, someone was resisting the bank's power. The farm crowd used numbers, intimidation, and local solidarity to force a low auction price. The robber used a gun. One could be defended as community self-protection. The other was violent theft. Yet both drew energy from the same anger, the feeling that legal financial power had become separated from moral fairness. If a family had worked land for years and lost it because prices collapsed beyond their control, the bank's legal claim felt cruel. If an outlaw frightened that bank, some people privately felt the world had balanced for a moment, even if by ugly means. City dwellers had their own reasons for resentment. Banks had closed with savings inside. Employers had cut wages. Landlords had evicted tenants. Police had broken up demonstrations. Relief offices had asked humiliating questions. A bank robbery story allowed people to imagine bold action in a life otherwise filled with waiting. Most would never pick up a gun. Most would never want to. But imagination is not bound by the same caution as behaviour. A tired man in a bread line could read about a robber escaping in a V8 Ford and feel for a few seconds that someone had refused the posture of defeat. Cars were central to the mythology. The automobile had represented freedom in the 1920s, and in the 1930s it became the outlaw's instrument of escape. Fast cars allowed gangs to move quicker than police wagons, to cross rural roads, to vanish into state lines, to turn geography into protection. The Ford V8, introduced in 1932, became especially associated with speed and power. Ordinary Americans who could barely afford gasoline read about criminals using cars to outrun the law. There was envy there, not always conscious. The outlaw had motion when the unemployed had lines. The outlaw had speed when families had waiting. The outlaw had cash when pay envelopes were empty. Again, This was fantasy more than fact. Life on the run was miserable and brief. But fantasy does not ask how well it ends. It asks how it feels from the sidewalk. Guns also change the atmosphere. The machine gun, especially the Thompson submachine gun, had become a symbol of gangster violence during Prohibition, and remained part of the public image of Depression crime. Most ordinary Americans did not handle such weapons, but they saw photographs and read descriptions. The sight of criminals armed like small armies made local police seem underprepared, and made the federal response seem modern and necessary. It also raised the stakes of public fascination. These were not Robin Hood figures carrying bows in a forest. They were men and women with firearms capable of killing quickly and indiscriminately. The romance was always built beside the grave. The victims are important to bring back into the room. A bank teller ordered to lie on the floor did not experience social revenge. He experienced terror. A police officer shot during pursuit was not an abstraction of authority to his wife or children. A bystander killed in crossfire had not caused the depression. A store owner robbed by Bonnie and Clyde might have been struggling to remain open. Outlaw legends often require distance from victims. The closer you stand to the people harmed, the harder it becomes to cheer. That is why the phrase secretly cheered matters. Much of the admiration was private, guilty, half-spoken, mixed with denial. People could enjoy the story in the newspaper and still be horrified by the blood in the street. Newspapers participated in this contradiction while pretending only to report it. They condemned crime, but they also sold crime. A dramatic headline moved copies. A photograph of a dead outlaw drew attention. A captured girlfriend, a jailbreak, a shootout, a hidden arsenal, a blood-stained car, all became material for readers. The public appetite encouraged more detail, and more detail fed more appetite. Law enforcement complained about glamorization, but law enforcement also benefited when the same coverage made their victories spectacular. The outlaw and the officer became opposing characters in a national serial, with the public turning pages as if the next installment might explain the age. It did not explain the age, but it revealed something about it. The popularity of bank robbers showed that many Americans had lost faith in the fairness of respectable power. Not all power, not all law, not all banks, but enough that a criminal attacking them could be interpreted as more than a criminal. This loss of faith did not begin with Dillinger or Floyd. It began with pay envelopes thinning, farms auctioned, savings lost, relief lines lengthening, and families discovering that doing everything right did not guarantee survival. The robber entered the stage after the audience had already been wounded. There is a small scene one can imagine in a farm kitchen. A newspaper lies open on the table. The headline reports another bank robbery. The farmer reads it while his wife pours coffee that has been stretched too thin. Their own mortgage is overdue. They know the banker by name. He may be polite. He may even be apologetic. But the notice still came. The farmer reads that a robber escaped with thousands. His wife says nothing. Perhaps after a while the farmer says, well, they can afford it. That sentence is not a legal argument. It is not a moral philosophy. It is a bruise speaking. In a city apartment, a similar scene. A man who has stood in relief lines reads about Dillinger. His son asks whether Dillinger is bad. The father pauses. A simple answer would be yes, and yes is not wrong. But the father has also spent months feeling that the world's rules protect the wrong people. He says he is a robber. Then perhaps he adds, but the banks are no saints. The child hears the complication. The law says one thing, the father's tone says another. This is how public trust changes, not only through speeches or elections, but through the hesitation before answering a child. The federal campaign against the outlaws eventually succeeded in the narrow sense. Dillinger was killed in 1934. Bonnie and Clyde were killed that same year. Pretty Boy Floyd was killed in 1934. Babyface Nelson died in 1934. Other gang members were captured or killed. By the mid-1930s, The most spectacular phase of the public enemy era had begun to fade. Stronger federal laws, better coordination, improved communication, and aggressive pursuit made the old style of roaming bank robbery more difficult. The outlaws burned brightly and briefly, as such figures often do. Their legends lasted longer than their careers, but removing them did not remove the conditions that had made people cheer. That required something broader: bank reform, deposit insurance, work relief, farm programs, labour protections, and a new idea that the federal government had some responsibility when the economic system failed on a national scale. The Emergency Banking Act and the creation of federal deposit insurance helped restore confidence in banks. New Deal programs put millions to work, though unevenly and not without controversy. Relief became less dependent on local charity alone. These changes did not end poverty or injustice, and they did not reach all Americans equally, but they helped rebuild the bridge between legality and survival. When people believed their savings were safer, when work existed, when relief had less humiliation attached, the bank robber lost some of his symbolic power. Still, the memory remained. Americans remembered the outlaws because they had appeared at a moment when anger needed faces. The faces were not clean. They were not innocent. They were often cruel, reckless, and violent, yet they carried public feelings that respectable politics had not yet fully absorbed. Hatred of banks, frustration with police, envy of speed, desire for revenge, fascination with people who seemed to act when everyone else was forced to wait. In that sense, the bank robber was not outside the Depression story. He was one of its distorted reflections. The danger in telling this part is that it can become exciting too easily. A getaway car is more cinematic than a breadline. A jailbreak is easier to dramatise than a relief application. A gunfight attracts more attention than a mother-watering soup. That was true in the 1930s, and it is still true now. But the outlaws only make sense if we keep them connected to the quieter world that produced their audience. Without the empty pay envelope, Dillinger is only a robber. Without foreclosures, Pretty Boy Floyd's legend loses its emotional charge. Without failed banks and public shame and visible hunger, the cheering becomes harder to understand. The crimes were spectacular, but the sympathy came from ordinary rooms, and outside those rooms, the country was still full of people who had never robbed a bank and never would. They lived in shacks along rivers, in cars beside roads, in tents near city dumps, in settlements named bitterly after the president many blamed for doing too little too late. They were watched by police, counted by charities, moved along by officials, photographed by journalists, and judged by citizens who were frightened by what poverty looked like when it gathered in one place. The outlaw had the luxury of motion, even if it ended badly. The shanty town had almost none. It stayed where the city could see it, and because it stayed, it forced another question into public life. When thousands of people are visibly breaking the rules of property, sanitation, public order, and respectable living simply by having nowhere else to go, does a whole settlement become a crime scene, or does it become evidence? The settlements did not usually begin as settlements. They began as one shelter, then another, then a few more arranged wherever a city had left a piece of land unwanted enough for desperate people to occupy it. A vacant lot near railroad tracks, a river bank that flooded in bad weather, the edge of a dump, a strip of land under a bridge, a place beside a road where no one had planned for families to live because no one had planned for so many families to have nowhere else to go. At first, a man might build a lean-to out of packing crates and tar paper, telling himself it was temporary. Then another man would add a shack nearby, made from scrap boards, flattened tin, cardboard, burlap, old doors, pieces of advertisement signs, anything that could stand against wind for one more night. Soon there would be paths worn in the dirt between shelters, a place for fires, a shared water source if they were lucky, children running where children should never have had to play. smoke rising in the morning from coffee cans and broken stoves. A settlement had appeared, not because anyone founded it, but because people kept arriving with no better place to sleep. Americans called these places Hoovervilles. The name was a political insult aimed at President Herbert Hoover, who became, fairly or not, the public face of a government many believed had failed to act with enough force during the first years of the Depression. A newspaper used as a blanket could be called a Hoover blanket. An empty pocket turned inside out could be called a Hoover flag. A car pulled by a horse because gasoline was too expensive could be called a Hoover wagon. The jokes were bitter, and they were everywhere because humour gave people a way to speak about humiliation without sounding as wounded as they were. But a Hooverville itself was not a joke. It was a map of failure built from scrap. Walk into one slowly, not as a tourist, not as someone looking for a dramatic photograph, but as someone trying to understand how a settlement like this actually worked. The first thing you would notice is the materials. Nothing matches. One wall might be made of orange crates, another from a sheet of corrugated metal. The roof might be tar paper weighted down with stones. A door might be an actual door taken from a demolished building, or it might be a blanket nailed over an opening. Some shacks were barely shelters, just enough structure to keep a body out of direct rain. Others, especially in larger or longer-lasting Hoovervilles, were surprisingly organised, with scavenged windows, shelves, small stoves, packed earth floors, and signs of domestic effort that are almost painful to imagine. A woman might sweep the dirt outside the entrance. Someone might hang a curtain. A family might place a tin can of flowers near the doorway. These details did not erase poverty. They showed that people were still trying to make a home out of materials that had already been thrown away. This matters because officials often described Hoovervilles as nuisances, hazards, eyesores, and threats to public order. They were all of those things in practical terms. They lacked sanitation. Fires could spread quickly. Disease could move through crowded camps. Crime could occur there, as it can anywhere people are desperate and unprotected. But for the people living inside them, Hoovervilles were also the last defence against complete exposure. A shack made of trash could still mean the difference between sleeping under a roof and sleeping on open ground. When city officials ordered such camps cleared, they often spoke in the language of cleanliness and safety. The residents heard something simpler: move. But to where? That question followed the poor everywhere in the Depression. Move along, leave the park, leave the doorway, leave the rail yard, leave the vacant lot. Do not sleep in the station. Do not gather near the courthouse. Do not beg on this street. Do not build here. The order was repeated by police, railroad guards, health inspectors, park officials, property owners, and relief administrators. Sometimes it was necessary from their point of view. Cities had to maintain sanitation, prevent fires, protect property, and reassure business districts that public spaces had not been surrendered to disorder. But moving a person does not house him. Clearing a camp does not create wages. Tearing down a shack does not answer hunger. It only changes the location of misery. The geography of desperation was new to many Americans because poverty had become harder to keep private. Before the Depression, the poor had always existed, of course, and in large numbers. Tenements, rural cabins, segregated neighbourhoods, mining camps, immigrant districts and worn-out farms had held poverty long before 1929. But the Depression pushed poverty into more visible places and into the lives of people who had not expected to belong to it. The respectable unemployed stood in lines downtown. Families who had once paid rent slept in cars. Men in suits waited outside missions. Children from formerly stable households appeared with hollow faces and patched clothes. Hoovervilles made the crisis visible in wood and tin. They embarrassed cities because they could not be explained away as individual failure. One shack might be blamed on one man. 1,000 shacks required a larger explanation. Some Hoovervilles became large enough to have internal arrangements. Seattle's Hooverville, one of the best known, lasted for years and developed a kind of local order. with residents selecting leaders and negotiating with city authorities. Other camps were smaller and more temporary, torn down, rebuilt, shifted, burned or abandoned. In some places, single men dominated. In others, whole families lived together. Some camps were racially mixed in ways unusual for the surrounding society, though not free from prejudice. Others were segregated by custom, pressure, or local hostility. The Depression brought people together under hardship, but it did not erase the older divisions of American life. Race, ethnicity, gender, and local belonging still shaped who was helped, who was suspected, and who was driven out first. Police wagons became part of this landscape. They were not always used for dramatic arrests. Sometimes they carried people from cleared camps. Sometimes they took men picked up for vagrancy. Sometimes they hauled away protesters after eviction fights. Sometimes they appeared outside relief offices when crowds grew angry. The police wagon was one of the ways the state entered the daily life of the desperate. Not as a welfare office, not as a job program, not as a doctor or a landlord willing to wait, but as a vehicle with barred windows or hard benches, ready to move bodies from a place where they were not wanted. Vagrancy was a particularly useful charge because it did not require the kind of specific act that theft did. A person could be arrested for lacking visible means of support, wandering, loitering, sleeping outdoors, or appearing idle in a place where authorities wanted motion. These laws had existed before the Depression and were often used against the poor, the unemployed, Black Americans, immigrants, labour organisers, and anyone considered troublesome. During the Depression, they became tools for managing the visible unemployed. If a city did not know how to feed everyone, it could at least move some people out of sight. A man without work could become legally suspect because he had no work. It was a circular trap. He was criminalised for the condition the economy had created. For a person arrested this way, the experience could be both frightening and degrading. He might spend a night or several in a local jail, be fined money he did not have, be ordered to leave town or be sentenced to labour. Some towns used jail as a rough shelter, giving men a place to sleep and a meal before pushing them onward. Others used it as punishment and warning. A night in jail could mean missing a chance at day labour. It could mean losing a place in a bread line. It could mean being marked by local police as a repeat problem. And for young people, especially boys on the road, it could be an education in resentment. When the first real attention society gives you is arrest, society should not be surprised if your respect for its rules weakens. Hoovervilles also raise questions about property that cities did not want to answer. Vacant land belonged to someone, even if unused. Bridges, parks, riverbanks, and dumps were controlled by public or private authorities. A shack built there was an illegal occupation. The person living in it was, in a technical sense, trespassing. But if thousands of citizens had no place to go, what did trespassing mean? Was a man committing a crime by sleeping under a bridge because rent had become impossible? Was a family living in a shack on city land a threat to public order, or proof that public order had already failed them? The law could answer quickly. History cannot answer so quickly if it wants to be honest. Evictions brought this question into ordinary streets. The scene became familiar in many cities. A marshal or sheriff arrived with papers. The landlord or his agent stood nearby. Furniture was carried out. Mattresses, chairs, a table, a stove if the family had one, trunks, dishes, bundles of clothing, perhaps a framed photograph that looked suddenly absurd on the sidewalk. Neighbours gathered. Children watched. The family stood among its own belongings under open sky, experiencing one of the most public humiliations poverty can produce. A home became a pile. A private life became an obstruction on the curb. Sometimes the story ended there. The family found relatives, a shelter, a room somewhere worse, a car, a camp, or nothing. But in some neighbourhoods, especially where unemployment councils and tenant groups organised resistance, the crowd did not merely watch. After the officers left, neighbours carried the furniture back inside. In other cases, they blocked the eviction before it happened. They filled stairways. They argued with marshals. They shouted. They threatened. They made the legal process physically difficult. This was a legal resistance, or close to it, depending on the specific act. It interfered with court orders and property rights. Yet many people saw it as justice because the formal law had produced a result that felt indecent, a family's bed in the street during a national emergency. There was courage in these actions and also risk. Police could return in larger numbers, people could be beaten or arrested, organisers could be targeted, landlords could become harsher. But anti-eviction actions revealed how the Depression altered the moral authority of property. A landlord might have the legal right to remove a tenant who had not paid. The tenant might truly owe rent. Yet the neighbourhood might decide that in 1932, with work scarce and relief inadequate, enforcement of that right had become socially intolerable. The law had not changed on paper. The crowd had changed around it. This kind of crowd action frightened officials because it suggested that ordinary people were beginning to create their own standards of emergency justice. Foreclosure auctions in rural areas showed the same pattern. Farmers and neighbours would gather and discourage bidding, sometimes with quiet intimidation, sometimes more openly. A farm might then be sold back to the original owner for a token amount. The process violated the spirit, and sometimes the letter, of the law. But to the people present, it corrected a large wrong. When legal machinery moved too smoothly against the desperate, citizens put their bodies into the gears. Police were then placed in a difficult and revealing position. Their job was to enforce orders, protect property, maintain public order and prevent violence. But many officers came from the same neighbourhoods they policed. Some had relatives out of work, some had unpaid bills themselves. A policeman evicting a family might know that his own cousin was behind on rent. A sheriff at a farm auction might know that half the county hated the bank more than the debtor. Enforcement became personal in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. Some officers carried out orders harshly, others delayed, warned, looked away, or did the minimum required. The Depression did not create one kind of police behaviour. It exposed the human choices inside enforcement. Relief offices developed their own geography of desperation. Lines formed outside them as they did outside missions and kitchens. Inside, clerks and investigators tried to sort need with inadequate resources and rules that often lagged behind reality. Applicants carried documents, letters, rent notices, and sometimes children because a child's presence made need visible. People were asked to prove poverty. They were asked whether they had relatives, whether they owned a radio, whether they had sold jewellery, whether the husband was really looking for work, whether the family had taken in boarders, whether they were morally worthy, though the question was rarely phrased so bluntly. The office became a place where private suffering had to be narrated to strangers in exchange for groceries, vouchers, fuel or rent assistance. When relief failed or delayed, anger gathered in the same spaces. A crowd outside an office was not only a line, it could become a protest if people believed favouritism, neglect or humiliation had gone too far. Police wagons sometimes waited nearby, not because everyone in line was dangerous, but because hunger in public made authorities nervous. The unemployed were expected to be grateful, patient, orderly and visibly deserving. But hunger does not always stand quietly when a clerk says there is no more aid today. The bonus army showed the nation a larger version of this conflict in 1932. Thousands of World War I veterans travelled to Washington, D.C. to demand early payment of a promised bonus that was not due until later. Many came with families. They built camps, including a large settlement on the Anacostia Flats. These were not foreign radicals in the public mind, not at first. They were veterans, men who had worn uniforms for the country. Their presence embarrassed the government because it combined patriotism, poverty and protest in one visible place. When authorities eventually moved to clear them, the operation involved police, federal troops, tear gas, tanks, cavalry and fire. Images and reports of veterans' camps being burned shocked many Americans. The event deepened the sense that the government could find force when it could not find relief quickly enough. The bonus army was not the same as an ordinary Hooverville, but it belonged to the same new geography. People without adequate support gathered in visible places and built temporary communities. Authorities tolerated them until they did not. The clearing of the camp became a national symbol because it showed how easily poverty could be treated as disorder once it occupied space the powerful wanted cleared. The question was not only whether the veterans' demand was legally correct. The question was what kind of country sends armed force against men asking for help after serving it. That question did political damage because many people already suspected the answer. Children in Hoovervilles experienced this world as childhood, because children have no other frame while living it. They played with scraps, ran between shacks, carried water, searched for wood, stood in relief lines, watched adults argue with police, and learned early that home could be dismantled by strangers. Some went to school if they could, others did not. Clothing, distance, shame, illness, and the need to help families kept many away. A child from a Hooverville might be teased by classmates or avoided by parents who feared disease and disorder. Poverty marked children socially as well as physically. They carried the address of desperation on their shoes and coats. Women in these settlements worked constantly to maintain any kind of household order, cooking with poor fuel, keeping children clean where water was limited, washing clothes without proper facilities, protecting daughters from danger, negotiating with relief agencies, managing illness, making a shack feel less like abandonment. The labour was immense and often unseen by outsiders who viewed camps as male spaces of unemployment. But families lived there too, and where families lived, domestic work followed, even when domestic tools were reduced to a bucket, a fire, a blanket, and a few battered pans. Sanitation was a real problem, and it would be sentimental to pretend otherwise. Camps without proper toilets, clean water, trash removal or drainage could become unhealthy quickly. Disease, lice, rats, contaminated water and smoke from poor fires were constant threats. City officials who raised these concerns were not always inventing excuses. The danger was real. But the remedy often focused on removal rather than housing. Tear down the shacks, clear the land, push the residents out. If no safer place was provided, the health problem became mobile. It moved to another vacant lot, another bridge, another camp beyond the city line. Desperation was treated like rubbish, swept from one place to another. The phrase public order appears often in official language, and it deserves attention. Public order can mean safety. It can mean passable streets, clean water, fire prevention, and protection from violence. But it can also mean the comfort of not seeing poverty too clearly. Many Hoovervilles offended because they made visible the part of society that polite business districts wanted hidden. A shack community near a rail line might be tolerated until it appeared too near a park, too near downtown, too near a place where shoppers, investors, or visitors might see it. Visibility became part of the offence. Poverty in the wrong place could be treated almost as an accusation. This visibility also shaped politics. Hoovervilles were not just shelters, they were arguments made of boards. Every time a newspaper printed a photograph of one, every time commuters passed one, every time a city cleared one and it returned, the settlement asked whether private charity and local relief were enough. The answer became harder to defend as the camps persisted. People could argue about economics, budgets, responsibility and character. But a city of shacks beside a city of empty buildings and unsold goods created a visual argument that did not require much explanation. Inside those settlements, the line between legal and illegal life was almost impossible to maintain cleanly. The shack itself might be illegal. The wood might have been scavenged from property where no one had permission to take it. The firewood might be stolen. Water might be drawn from a place not intended for the camp. Men might enter rail yards to look for work or ride trains. Women might sell food, laundry, or small services without licenses. Children might scavenge in dumps where entry was prohibited. None of this made the residents hardened criminals. It meant that once a person fell outside formal housing and employment, ordinary survival required constant contact with rules not designed for such conditions. People in Hoovervilles built community anyway. They shared tools, they watched children, they traded information about relief and work. They cared for the sick as well as they could. They developed routines, names, reputations, and small hierarchies. A man who could repair a stove had value. A woman who knew how to stretch food had authority. Someone who could read official notices helped those who could not. Someone with a connection to a church or relief agency might become important. Even in crisis, people organise themselves because human beings do that. Disorder from the outside can contain a great deal of order within it. At night, the settlements changed. Fires burned low. Voices carried through thin walls. Trains sounded nearby. Police raids were more frightening after dark because families could be awakened suddenly, ordered out, watched as shelters were destroyed or searched. A person who had built a shack from scraps might have to stand by as it was knocked apart in minutes. Think about that labour, the finding of materials, the carrying, the fastening, the effort to make a roof hold, then the arrival of men with authority to undo it. To officials, they were clearing illegal structures. To residents, they were destroying the last proof that the family had a place. The new geography of desperation extended beyond Hoovervilles to the roads. Families lived in automobiles, sometimes with belongings tied to the sides and children sleeping across seats. Cars broke down and became stationary homes. Migrants camped near fields, irrigation ditches and town edges. Some were fleeing Dust Bowl conditions, especially later in the decade, but many were simply following any rumour of work. Local communities often feared them. They were called transients, migrants, outsiders, sometimes worse. Border checkpoints and local police discouraged entry in some places. The question of who had the right to be in a place became urgent. If work was the reason to move, but no work appeared, the migrant quickly became unwanted. For African Americans, Mexican Americans, and immigrant communities, the geography was still more constrained. Relief discrimination, job exclusion, deportation campaigns, segregation and racial violence shaped where people could live, work, or seek help. Mexican and Mexican-American families in the 1930s faced repatriation campaigns that pressured or forced many to leave the United States, including citizens. Black Americans were often the first fired and last hired, and relief was frequently unequal. A Hooverville might be desperate for everyone, but the roads out of it were not equally open. The Depression's criminalisation of poverty rested on older structures of exclusion, and those structures decided who was most likely to be treated as a public problem rather than a neighbour in trouble. Yet even with all of this, many people in settled homes feared Hoovervilles. They feared theft, they feared disease, they feared falling property values, they feared disorder near children, they feared the reminder that they too might fall. That last fear may have been the deepest. A Hooverville showed that poverty was not always somewhere else. It was close enough to walk to. It could be built from the same crates that delivered goods to stores where respectable people shopped. It could contain men who had once held jobs like theirs, women who had once kept homes like theirs, children who had once sat in classrooms beside theirs. The settlement was a warning made visible. By the time federal programs began expanding work relief and housing efforts, the country had already seen what happened when desperation was left to arrange itself. It did not vanish. It built. It gathered. It occupied. It rode trains, filled parks, blocked evictions, and forced police departments to become managers of economic failure. The law could arrest a man for vagrancy, but it could not arrest unemployment. It could tear down a shack, but it could not tear down the reasons shacks kept appearing. It could remove furniture from an apartment, but neighbours could carry it back. Again and again, enforcement met conditions larger than enforcement. That is why the geography of the Depression mattered so much. Bread lines showed hunger, rail yards showed motion without permission, coal yards showed need crossing property lines, bank robberies showed public anger turned into spectacle, Hoovervilles showed poverty settling into space and refusing to remain invisible. Each place taught Americans something about the limits of the old answers. Telling people to be patient did not feed them, calling them trespassers did not house them, arresting them did not employ them, moving them along did not create somewhere to go, and as these places multiplied, the law itself began to look strained. Not gone, not powerless. Police still arrested, courts still sentenced, landlords still filed papers, banks still enforced claims, and cities still cleared camps. But underneath that machinery, the question had changed. More Americans were asking whether strict enforcement made sense when the rules were being applied to people trapped by a national collapse. Judges, sheriffs, relief workers, federal officials, and ordinary citizens all confronted versions of the same problem. At what point does punishment become less useful than assistance? At what point does a hungry trespasser reveal more about failed policy than failed character? At what point does a government that can send police wagons also have to send jobs, food, insurance, and rent relief? The next movement in this story begins there, not because the law suddenly became gentle, and not because suffering ended quickly, but because the pressure of millions of ordinary people living at the edge forced America to reconsider what the law was for when obedience alone could no longer keep a family alive. The law did not bend because it suddenly became kind. It bent because too many people were leaning against it at once. That is the part of the story worth holding carefully. Governments do not usually wake up one morning and decide, out of pure generosity, to change the way a nation treats hunger, unemployment, eviction, bank failure, and old age. Change comes when the old answers stop working in public. By the early 1930s, the old answers had become painfully visible. Telling a man to find work did not help when no work existed. Telling a family to pay rent did not help when wages had disappeared. Telling a farmer to honour his mortgage did not help when crop prices had collapsed so low that harvest itself felt like a cruel joke. Telling hungry people not to steal did not explain what they were supposed to do when bread, coal, milk, and shelter remained legally protected but practically unreachable. The law still had power, police still had wagons, courts still had papers, banks still had claims, landlords still had rights. But across the country, more and more Americans were asking whether a system that could enforce every debt and punish every trespass but could not keep families from freezing had mistaken order for justice. At first, the bending happened informally. A grocer looked away when a mother took more than she could pay for. A judge dismissed a food theft with a warning. A sheriff delayed an eviction because he knew the family and had no stomach for putting their bed in the street. A town jail let unemployed men sleep on the floor and fed them breakfast before sending them onward. A neighbour carried furniture back inside after the marshal left. A banker quietly extended a farm note another month, knowing full well that the rules from above did not encourage mercy. These were not national programs. They were local hesitations, small refusals to apply the full force of the law against people whose real crime was being caught in a disaster larger than themselves. But local mercy has limits. It depends on personalities, moods, prejudice, resources, and whether the person in need is seen as deserving. One family received patience, another got the wagon, one boy was sent home, another went to jail. A country cannot run on accidental mercy for long. That was the problem America had to face. The Depression had made private charity too small, local relief too weak, and moral lectures too thin. The scale had changed. This was not one lazy man, one unlucky widow, one failing farm, one reckless debtor, one family that had failed to plan. It was millions. When the number becomes large enough, blame begins to lose its usefulness. You can blame one household for falling. You can blame a neighbourhood if you're determined. But when banks close in state after state, when factories shut down across industries, when farm families lose land despite years of labour, when cities cannot feed the lines forming outside their own doors, the explanation has to grow. The law had been built around individual responsibility, but the crisis had revealed collective failure. The first great shift came through the banks, because trust in money is one of the invisible foundations of ordinary life. When that trust breaks, everything trembles. In March 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt entered the presidency with the banking system in crisis. States had already begun closing banks or restricting withdrawals. People were frightened, and frightened people do exactly what makes banks weaker. They run to pull out whatever money they can before the doors close. Roosevelt declared a national bank holiday shortly after taking office, temporarily closing banks so the government could inspect them and restore confidence before reopening those judged sound. To modern ears, the phrase bank holiday sounds almost pleasant, as if the banks were taking a vacation. It was not pleasant. It was emergency surgery. The patient was the nation's trust. Then came reforms meant to convince ordinary depositors that their savings would not simply vanish because a bank failed. Federal deposit insurance, created through banking legislation in 1933, changed the psychology of savings. That may sound technical, but it mattered in the deepest domestic sense. A working family placing money in a bank needed to believe that the money would still be there when rent came due, when sickness arrived, when seed had to be purchased, when winter coal was needed. Before deposit insurance, a failed bank could erase a life's savings with a notice on a locked door. Afterward, the federal government stood behind small deposits in a way it had not before. This was the law bending toward ordinary fear. It did not make people rich. It did not give jobs to everyone. But it answered one of the Depression's most terrifying lessons, that respectable behaviour could still be punished by institutional collapse. That change also weakened some of the emotional ground on which outlaw sympathy had grown. If banks were safer, if deposits were protected, if the financial system looked less like a private machine that could break and leave families ruined, then the bank robber lost part of his strange appeal. He could still be fascinating, still dangerous, still newspaper material, but he no longer stood quite so easily as revenge against a hated symbol. Reform did not only change balance sheets, it changed the moral weather. When institutions behave with more responsibility, the people who attack them look less like avengers and more like what they are, criminals with guns. The law bent in another direction through relief. Harry Hopkins, who became one of Roosevelt's most important relief administrators, understood something blunt and practical that earlier approaches had often avoided. People needed help quickly, and they needed work if work could be provided. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration sent federal money to states for relief, making clear that local charity alone could not carry the burden. This was a major shift. For generations, Americans had often treated poverty as a local matter or a private moral condition. The Depression forced the federal government into the kitchen, the coal bin, the rent notice, the grocery line. Not literally in every home, not evenly, not perfectly, but more than before. Relief was controversial because it touched old American nerves. Many people feared dependency. Many believed assistance should be temporary, limited, and morally supervised. Some worried that giving aid without work would weaken character. Others argued that starving people while debating character was indecent. This argument ran through the 1930s in many forms and has never entirely left American politics. But the Depression gave one side of the argument a hard fact to stand on. Private effort was not enough. Millions of people had tried. They had walked for work, sold possessions, taken in boarders, stretched food, stood in lines, and swallowed pride. If hunger still remained, then hunger could no longer be explained only as personal failure. Work relief became one of the most important ways the law and government changed their relationship to the unemployed. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work in forests, parks, soil conservation, flood control, and other outdoor projects. For many families, a son in the CCC meant food, structure, clothing, and a small wage, much of which could be sent home. It also meant a boy who might otherwise have ridden the rails had a legal place to go, a bunk, meals, discipline, and work that the nation could recognise as useful. Think about that transformation. The same restless, hungry young man who might have been chased from a boxcar as a trespasser could now be issued work clothes and sent to plant trees. His character had not changed. The legal frame around his need had changed. The Works Progress Administration, created later, carried that idea on a broader scale. It put millions to work building roads, bridges, schools, airports, parks, sidewalks, public buildings, and also supported writers, artists, musicians, actors, and researchers. Critics mocked some projects. They complained about waste, politics, inefficiency, and the expansion of federal power. Some criticism was grounded in real problems. Large programs always have flaws, and the New Deal was no exception. But for a man who had spent months being told no at factory gates, a WPA job was not an abstraction. It was wages. It was a reason to leave the house in the morning without shame. It was food bought instead of begged. It was coal paid for instead of stolen. It was children seeing their father work again. That matters. Dignity is not a decorative part of relief. It is one of the things relief must try to restore. This is where crime prevention becomes less dramatic but more important. We often think of fighting crime as police, courts, prisons, detectives, and laws. Those things matter, but during the Depression another truth became visible. A job can prevent a theft before a policeman ever hears of it. A rent payment can prevent an illegal occupation. A food program can prevent shoplifting. Deposit insurance can prevent panic. A mortgage adjustment can prevent a foreclosure protest. A youth work camp can prevent a boy from becoming a vagrant on the rails. The law began to bend not simply by becoming softer after crimes occurred, but by trying to remove some of the pressures that had made ordinary people break rules in the first place. Farm policy attempted a similar shift, though not without contradictions. Farmers had suffered terribly from low prices, debt, drought in some regions, and mortgage pressure. Programs tried to raise agricultural prices, stabilise income, and slow the flood of foreclosures. Some measures were deeply controversial, especially when crops were reduced or livestock destroyed in a nation where people were hungry. To a family in a breadline, the idea of ploughing under crops could seem obscene, even if policymakers argued that raising prices was necessary to keep farms alive. The Depression was full of such painful trade-offs. Still, the broader purpose was to make farming viable enough that rural families would not be driven into theft, protest, migration, or collapse. A farmer with a fairer price had less reason to stand with neighbours blocking an auction. A mortgage adjusted in time could keep a sheriff's notice from becoming a public confrontation. Housing and eviction remained difficult. The New Deal did not solve the housing crisis overnight, and many families continued to live in poor conditions, camps, doubled-up rooms and temporary shelters. But over time, federal involvement in housing, refinancing and mortgage relief changed the idea that keeping people sheltered was only a private matter between landlord, lender and tenant. This was another bending of the old order. Property rights remained powerful, but they no longer stood entirely alone in the moral imagination. The question of whether people could remain housed during catastrophe became a public concern. The law also bent through repeal of prohibition in 1933. This may seem like a separate story, but it belongs in the same decade of changing attitudes toward law, crime, and ordinary behaviour. Prohibition had already made millions of Americans comfortable with the idea that a law could be widely violated, unevenly enforced, and morally disputed. It had created illegal markets, empowered organised crime, and strained respect for law itself. Repeal did not end crime, but it removed one major area where ordinary people and criminal networks had met in defiance of federal law. During the Depression, legal alcohol also meant tax revenue and jobs. The end of Prohibition showed that when a law lost enough public legitimacy, the country might choose to change the law rather than keep punishing endless violations. But this bending was never equal. That must be said plainly. New Deal relief and legal mercy did not reach everyone in the same way. Black Americans often faced discrimination in employment, relief, housing, and policing. Mexican and Mexican-American communities faced repatriation campaigns and exclusion. Native communities dealt with poverty shaped by long histories of dispossession and federal control. Women's labour was often undervalued, and many programs were designed around male breadwinner assumptions. Domestic and agricultural workers, many of them black, were excluded from key labour protections in ways that reflected political compromise with Southern segregationists. The law bent, but it bent around power. Some people felt the new support sooner. Some felt only the old hand of enforcement. In the South, especially, the relationship between poverty, race, and criminalisation remained severe. A black man accused of theft in Depression America did not stand before the law in the same position as a white man accused of the same act. Local prejudice could decide whether hunger was seen as misfortune or proof of criminal nature. Chain gangs, convict labour, discriminatory policing and racial terror did not disappear because the federal government created relief programs. For many black families, the Depression added economic desperation to a legal system already dangerous. Any honest account of the law bending has to admit that it did not bend enough, and it did not bend evenly. Immigrants and suspected radicals also encountered the harder edge of the state. Labour protests, unemployed demonstrations, and communist-led organising were often met with surveillance, arrests, and force. Some of the most effective anti-eviction actions and unemployment councils were associated with left-wing groups, which made authorities more suspicious even when the immediate demand was as basic as keeping a family indoors. The government could expand relief with one hand and police dissent with the other. That contradiction is not unusual in history. States often respond to suffering and unrest at the same time, trying to reduce the need that causes disorder, while also controlling the people who organise around it. For ordinary families, though, the changes were felt less as ideology than as small alterations in what a day required. A relief check meant the grocer could be paid. A work assignment meant the father no longer had to leave before dawn and return with nothing. A CCC enrolment meant one less son riding freight trains. A federal job meant coal in the bin. Deposit insurance meant a reopened savings account could be trusted again. Social Security, passed in 1935, offered the beginning of a new promise for old age, unemployment insurance, and support systems that acknowledged a person might need help not because of moral failure, but because life and markets could fail. These programs were incomplete and excluded too many, but the principle mattered. The federal government was no longer merely a distant referee of private contracts. It was becoming, slowly and unevenly, a participant in basic security. That word security is important. We often discuss the Depression in terms of money, but what people lost was security. The feeling that tomorrow had some structure, that savings were real, that work could be found. That old age would not mean destitution, that a temporary crisis would not become a criminal record. That hunger would not force a mother into a store with theft in her mind. When security vanishes, law becomes harder to obey because obedience depends on believing that obedience will still allow survival. The New Deal did not make America secure in any complete sense, but it admitted that security was a public concern. That admission was one of the greatest bends in the law's meaning. There were critics who believed the bend went too far. They argued that federal relief undermined local responsibility. The work programs wasted money, that government was becoming too large, that aid encouraged dependency, that business confidence was being damaged. These arguments were not marginal. They were part of the political struggle of the decade. Some came from self-interest, some from genuine constitutional concern, some from fear of debt, some from belief in older forms of individualism. The Depression did not create unanimity. It created an argument over what kind of country America should become when the market failed. That argument was fought in courts, elections, newspapers, Congress, state houses, union halls, relief offices, and around family tables. The Supreme Court challenged parts of the New Deal, striking down some early programs and forcing changes. Roosevelt responded politically, sometimes aggressively, and the constitutional boundaries of federal economic action shifted over time. This may sound far from the coal sack and the stolen apple, but it is connected. Behind the legal battles was the same central question. Could the federal government act broadly to stabilise economic life, or would older limits leave families dependent on local charity, private markets, and personal endurance? The courtroom language was formal. The stakes were practical. Work, wages, farms, banks, and relief stood behind the arguments. By the late 1930s, the most desperate early years had changed shape, though hardship remained. Unemployment was still high. The recovery was uneven. The Dust Bowl drove migration and suffering. Many families remained poor. Some New Deal programs were reduced or challenged. War production, not the New Deal alone, would eventually bring the fullest employment recovery. But the moral landscape had shifted. The idea that the federal government bore responsibility for economic security had entered American life permanently, not without resistance, not without limits, not without exclusions, but it had entered. And what happened to the ordinary crimes of survival? They did not vanish all at once. People still stole food, people still trespassed, people still slept where they were not allowed, people still lied when systems asked questions too cruelly. But when relief expanded and work returned, the pressure eased for many. A family with groceries did not need to send a child after milk bottles. A man with a paycheck did not need to risk arrest for coal. A boy earning money in a federal program did not need to climb into a boxcar. The important lesson is not that people became better when helped. It is that many had never become worse. They had been trapped. When the trap loosened, the criminal behaviour often loosened with it. This is a lesson societies forget whenever times improve. In comfort, it becomes easy to divide people into the lawful and the unlawful, the responsible and the irresponsible, the good and the bad. Hard times reveal that some of those divisions are real, and some are supported by luck, wages, health, housing, family help, and timing. The Great Depression did not prove that everyone will steal if hungry. Many did not. It did not prove that crime is always excusable. It is not. It did prove that law and morality become unstable when large numbers of people cannot meet basic needs through legal means. A society that wants obedience must provide more than punishment. It must provide a path by which ordinary people can survive without becoming offenders. There is a quiet image that brings this home better than any policy summary. A man who once stole coal now stands in line for a work assignment instead of a bread line. He is still tired. His shoes are still worn. The job may be temporary, the pay modest, the future uncertain. But when he returns home, he brings money that can be explained openly. The coal delivered later is paid for. The children see it arrive in the ordinary way. No one has to avoid asking where it came from. No one has to hide relief behind silence. The stove is lit and the warmth carries no secret. That is what lawful survival feels like. Not luxury, not triumph. Just the absence of shame where shame had been forced to live. Another image. A woman enters a grocery with a voucher, a small relief payment, or wages from sewing done under a public program. She still counts carefully. She still cannot buy everything, but she can place bread, milk, beans, and maybe apples on the counter without waiting for the grocer to turn away. She can look at him directly. He can write the sale properly. the child beside her learns a different lesson from the one he might have learned in 1931. He learns that food can be obtained without fear. That lesson is ordinary in good times. In the Depression, it was a repair. The law bending did not mean the end of hardship, and it did not erase the memories of what people had done to survive. Families carried those memories quietly. A grandfather who never wasted coal. A grandmother who saved every jar. A father who distrusted banks even after deposit insurance. A mother who could not bear to see milk poured down a sink. People who lived through the Depression often developed habits that looked excessive to later generations, because later generations did not feel the old pressure behind them. Saving string was not eccentric if you remembered when string had used. Keeping canned goods was not anxiety if you remembered empty shelves. Paying debts quickly, avoiding banks, hiding cash, feeding guests too much, cleaning plates, reusing foil, walking rather than spending bus fare, all of these could be forms of memory. Some also remembered the law differently. They remembered when it had been a threat. The eviction notice, the railroad bull, the police wagon, the relief investigator, the court, the bank paper. Even after reforms, trust did not return instantly. A government that helps today may have punished yesterday. A bank insured now may have failed then. A policeman who keeps order may still resemble the man who cleared a camp. Institutions recover slowly in the minds of those who suffered under them. That is another legacy of a crisis. Repairing material damage is difficult. Repairing trust may take longer. Still, something had changed. The Depression forced America to see that ordinary life depends on supports people often do not notice until they break. Employment systems, banking rules, housing stability, relief structures, public health, fair wages, the ability to move for work without being treated as a criminal, the ability to ask for help without surrendering all dignity. When these supports failed, ordinary Americans crossed legal lines in large and small ways. When some supports were rebuilt, the distance between citizenship and criminality widened again. That may be the most unsettling truth in this whole story. Many of the people who broke the law during the Depression were not fundamentally different from those who did not. They were closer to the edge, or reached the edge sooner, or had fewer relatives, fewer savings, fewer protections, darker skin in a racist system, an accent that marked them as foreign, a farm in a region hit harder, a job in an industry that collapsed earlier, a child who got sick at the worst possible time. The difference between the person in the breadline and the person passing by was sometimes not virtue. Sometimes it was one more week of wages, one relative with a spare room, one bank that stayed open, one landlord willing to wait. When we look back at the Great Depression and ask how ordinary Americans became criminals, the answer is not that they suddenly lost their morals. The better answer is that the country put them in situations where survival and legality began to separate. Some crossed the line reluctantly, some crossed it angrily, some crossed it and kept going into real harm. Some never crossed it at all, but understood those who did. The law finally began to bend when enough people recognized that punishing desperation was not the same as solving it. The Depression left America with new institutions, new arguments, new fears, and new expectations. It also left behind stories that were rarely told in full because families often cleaned them up before passing them down. They remembered endurance more easily than theft, thrift more easily than hunger, work relief more easily than eviction, the first paycheck more easily than the night someone carried coal home in a sack. But the hidden parts matter. They remind us that history is not only made by leaders signing laws or criminals firing guns. It is made at back doors, in courtrooms, at relief desks, in rail yards beside stoves, and in the quiet moment when a person looks at something they cannot afford and decides what kind of rule can survive the night. And somewhere in the middle of the 1930s, in a house that had gone quiet years earlier, sound slowly returned. Not all at once, Not everywhere, not for everyone. But in some homes, a pay envelope came back to the table. A radio played a little louder. A child asked for more food and received it without the room tightening. A mother bought milk instead of explaining why there was none. A father slept without planning a trip to the coal yard. Outside, the country was still arguing over what had been done and what it had cost. Inside, the stove burned with fuel that had been paid for, and for that evening at least no one in the house had to become a criminal to keep the dark from coming in.